Short course, long march, the old and new realism of Green Boys. Dear Diary, no one understands me, except you. This is how the secret confessions of teenagers in love begin. Necessity knows no law and reaches for literary expression. The aimless stammering in the face of the beloved is reflected in prose that is all the more loquacious. Once the effusive enthusiasm for the opposite sex and for one's own depth of feeling has subsided, fashion and soccer reassert their ancestral rights and take over the soul. The bedroom eyes of the now betrothed have no chance against Tony Schumacher's toned calf. When every tremor and quiver is for the due installment, the diary is bound to be sidelined. Henceforth, it must eke out its existence in the corner, stowed away somewhere behind the meters of Bertelsmann reading material. What is no longer suitable for intimate discussion now serves as carefully stored evidence in reserve for the ultimate marital quarrel, proving that there is nothing special and no artistry about orchestrating one's love pain like Donella and Konsalik. It is not the ability that is lacking, only the will. The social and hygienic effect of this devaluation of the diary is considerable. On the one hand, there is a certain scarcity of texts of self-understanding and literature of consternation. The average writer leaves the terrain to poets and politicians. If heartfelt confessions are being made as professionally and as inflationarily as Joschka Fischer's confession to Spiegel magazine, I catch myself longing for myself, then the reader may indeed yearn for his own alienation, but writing it down is no longer worth the effort and only invites the therapist's rebuke for amateurish self-medication. On the other hand, the boredom that arises when reading the diary for the first time forges a bond between generations. The children and grandchildren, who quickly examine the inherited stuff for the alternative, flea market or bulky waste, may reflect contemplatively on the eternal human when skimming through the waste paper and wonder whether the human will ever become clever, but only on the assumption that the suspicion that the old man was always a child's head does not find any later evidence than that from puberty. The fact that passion for self-expression usually fades in adulthood unconsciously takes into account the fact that you can no longer experience anything without immediately putting it into words. No matter how beautiful love may be, its literary reflection becomes its direct opposite. Silence recognizes the sad truth that there must be something about even the seemingly private feeling that forces the commonplace as its necessary linguistic form. It is therefore by no means a lack of vocabulary and power of speech alone that leads to weariness of the diary. Rather, subjective disgust is preserved in silence from the inescapable expropriation of feeling through the flat cliché. For years, Joschka Fischer's work as a politician and author has been dedicated to the decisive opposition to the secret disgust for the phrase. If his engagement had been limited to the complaint printed in the materials against the Factory Society, there would be no particular reason for criticism. At the time, Autonomy published the first installment of the series, now continued in Der Spiegel under the heading Lust am Regieren, The Joy of Governing, under the headline Befreiung and Militancy. A foray into more primitive times. In 1977, at the age of 28, having just reached the outer limits of adolescence, Fischer let it be known that he still lacked something to fully establish his revolutionary identity and make himself comfortable in it. He had taken up the class struggle against capitalism within us as instructed, but a crazy sensibility was needed for the last stand. Producing the desired proved to be relatively easy to accomplish. Fischer simply combined the then common critique of the master thinkers, André Glucksmann, with the concerns against male fantasies, Klaus Thueleit, that have now become the alternative human understanding, and finally stabilized his journeyman's piece with a two-component adhesive made of ecology and feminism. The astounding result: one must now finally take that path that has proven so insanely productive for women, the revolutionization of everyday life, or in other words, our revolution cannot do without the objectification of utopias in our everyday lives. The linguistically sloppy protest hid the dilemma that the liberation from militancy had to be expressed in terms that were still indebted to revolutionary phraseology. It took the whole range of Frankfurt Sponti jargon to justify the actually banal result of the first diary delivery, the discovery and satisfaction of my needs. Seen from today's perspective, Fischer's linguistic bombast makes sense, since at the time he must have felt like Columbus, seeking revolution, finding everyday life in the shared flat kitchen. You only realize what a youthful folly is when it becomes chronic. What seems to the half-witted person to be somehow a deviant form of behavior becomes a patented trademark for the aged, now professional freak Fischer about Fischer. What is obvious to the rebellious altar boy, the solemn discovery of the self, becomes second nature to the minister and turns into a promotional technique. On February 9, 1987, for example, Fischer writes in the diary of Spiegel magazine, "I came here prejudiced against civil servants. My whole life as a freak can be explained by my mother's iron determination to make me a civil servant with pension rights at all costs, and I am disabused. The essence of Fisher's undogmatic attitude is not yet apparent from the admission that bureaucrats are not in fact the malevolent monsters that the parking offender, arguing about his parking ticket, declares them to be. Anyone else who was merely offered the opportunity to have a drink with the fines office would be just as cured of prejudice. Nor is the surprise that after dismissing the prejudice about the officials, the critique of the social function of the administration does not finally begin. This point can be derived without difficulty from Fisher's realpolitik eco-libertarian attitude. What is surprising is that the son seems to have inherited none of the dialectical consciousness of the mother, who probably sensed that nowadays you can only become a man through protest. From eternal materialism, Joschka has retained only the shrewdness that prompts him to pass off his class background as innate, unchangeable, and a special personal advantage. The bourgeois statesman also does not publish diaries because he does not want to admit that it was not he, but his cunning creator, who decided that he should become a politician. He sees himself as a state organ, not as a mama's boy. The mere protocol of political life, which makes the fate of the state appear as pure improvisation, as a busy muddling through from day to day, and the personal charisma of the administrators of power as an eccentric quirk, is not his cup of tea. He leaves this business to the party executives and political apprentices and writes his memoirs instead of a diary. The value of memoirs lies in the fact that the statesman understands the everyday workings of politics as the form in which, unconscious of the workings themselves, the sovereignty of the state is realized. The reason why memoirs are incapable of the naivety of a diary, the reason why political autobiography therefore constantly oscillates between fatalism and cynicism, lies in the fact that the statesman sees himself as the character mask and the human material of the state purpose. In contrast to the generation of politicians that has emerged since Peter Glotz's Innenausstattung der Macht, the interior design of power, reading the memoirs of someone like Heinrich Brüning or Konrad Adenauer never gives rise to the suspicion that politics is only done for the sake of self-discovery and the diary. In the diary of the political manager and apprentice, the mere material character of the political life remains raw and unpenetrated, a shapeless mass of life that only finds its unity in the mechanical flow of time and whose literary expression makes one believe that there is no other unity besides this purely formal one. Politics dissolves into an endless chain of negotiations, agreements, talks and compromises, disintegrating into diplomatic maneuvers and cleverly constructed administrative traps. The only thing the blind juggernaut allows is the struggle for what Joschka Fischer calls political survival, the fear of political suicide, and the fear of slowly losing one's political mind. It is understandable that in this chaos, the desire to finally find someone with whom one can speak frankly and freely thrives above all. The remedy of politics is honest dialogue, sincere communication. Only belief in the power of consensus as a therapeutic agent makes it possible to stop the Sisyphean struggle against misunderstanding. Just as the idea of politics consists in the application of the law against everyone, and without exception, so its reality consists in a vast number of people who have no idea about it. It is teeming with Jesuitical characters who with subtle legal logic go around the political problems like a cat around a hot stick, people who are not really ministers, only play them, ragged figures whose political and moral excess is unbearable, and finally a lot of gamblers who confuse politics with cheating. A real hell, a dance floor of political monkey dances around the idol of tactics, which finds its diabolical apotheosis in the class idiocy of the entrepreneurs. All this drives Fischer so far from political rationality that in the end he takes refuge in the theory of state monopoly capitalism. Despite the fall from grace among politicians, who do nothing but embarrass the idea of politics, Fischer can remain relatively calm, for he has an infallible compass for navigating the general direction of this confusion, his political instinct, his maternal inheritance. It is precisely these unconsciously unblemished, naturally animalistic parts of him that allow him to flee to where he picks up the scent of honest communication. In the figure of Holger Borner, he recognizes the down payment on the true idea of the political, a piece of holistically embodied objectified utopia. Here is a person to whom the spoken word applies, a politician who works through the whole person, who even, if he suffers damage to his very own understanding of the state, gets an identity crisis. The idea of the political has a hard time. The political space is constantly besieged by externally controlled interests. That's just how it is in politics. Although the political class knows exactly what function all the disparate political cultures, understandings of the state, traditions actually have, namely the different scents on offer in a monopoly perfumery. It is only through the pluralism of understandings of the state that the unity of the raison d'etat is reproduced. Winking at his cabinet colleagues, The politician observes the respective conventions, but he knows full well that this is not what matters. Fisher's nonchalance, on display for all to see, is only intended to generate the brand loyalty among the clientele that is necessary in the higher-level interests of the political establishment. Therefore, the telegenic swearing-in of an age-old spontaneist without street-fighting attire cannot be dispensed with, but afterwards, never again sneakers. By meeting the needs of the audience, the political class simultaneously makes the alienation from the political more unpleasant. Thus, in a sad hour, the Prime Minister admits to his apprentice that Fisher knows, of course, that we are both dependent on interests and not always free in our decisions. In the administration of the reasons of state independence and freedom, i.e. the politician's impartiality in relation to the issues, arise as if by themselves, only because the public is so conventional does something occasionally go wrong. The resulting forced formal pause in the reasons of state serves the election campaign and thus the refreshening of the olfactory senses of the voting public. In the war of position against the sabotage of the political, in the threefold defense against the alienation by the political lay actors, the public and finally the administration, the political apprentice necessarily becomes a pluralist. In contrast, the statesman sees in this confusion the form of the political, the mechanics of the political unit. The adolescent bourgeois politician sincerely believes that the state is the sum of its parts and that state action is the result of all the votes cast in the formulation of the will of the state. For this reason, politics as a profession is essentially communication for the apprentice. If only it were possible to talk the consensus into existence that is supposed to join the parts into the whole, then, so the illusion of the political subject, the administration would already knuckle under and really become the technical means of political ends. He cannot notice that sovereignty has always existed precisely in the dualism of political will and legally codified administrative action. He thinks that it depends on him first. He wants to create it out of himself. Something is missing, and he articulates the shortcoming as a democratic gap, Otto Schiele, as a lack of agreement among the political class on the subjection of the administration. Again and again, he fights for the congruence of expertise and political will, for the agreement of objective feasibility and political enforceability. It is this dualism that constitutes the fetish character of politics. It is incomprehensible how the synthesis of the political could ever arise from the simple contradiction, were it not for something that produces the unity just as necessarily as it simultaneously veils it from the consciousness of the politician, and the audience the antagonism between competence and will, also articulated as the contradiction between an ethics of conviction versus an ethics of responsibility, leads back to money, which, in the economic sphere, performs that mysterious transubstantiation, Marx, of the tremendous pluralism of desires, intentions and tastes into the accumulation of capital. The third element that guarantees the unity of formal contradictions in the political is sovereignty, the value form of politics. In an ideological reversal, political consciousness is also familiar with this. Fisher articulates his project as the struggle of reality against ideology. Even in his Sponti days, his life was the struggle of fundamentalists against realists, against the superiority of ideology, against being in the red and for the limitations of a mark. Money provides the model of a unity that functions as mysteriously as it does in reality. The political apprentice learns from the contradictions of politics that unity can be established in the long term through communication as a regulative idea, but that for the time being it is he himself who offers the only guarantee of success. Since he can only understand the always already ready-made sovereignty in ideological reversal, he does not understand it at all and declares himself to be the always already present synthesis. In his mind, attitude and responsibility, value judgment and expertise, intention and result are always already identical. In the reflection of the diary, the sovereignty that he now exercises is replaced by the ego of the politician, his political identity, as the only thing that offers orientation in the midst of the horse trading of the political game. The calculation of one's own person and the demands to which one must remain loyal offers the last chance to order the chaos of the political material. In the concept of political identity, reasons of state and election campaigns converge. The political subject agitates with his suffering from politics, presents himself as someone who is affected and who, with all the fibers of his personality, defends himself against the expropriation by the state. Suffering from expropriation legitimizes the political will that carries out the expropriation. Inclination leads its shadowboxing against duty. The first Green Environment Minister simply has to demonstrate against this nuclear madness, Fisher noted on a trip to Wackersdorf on December 14, 1985. He has to because he has to symbolically distance himself from Joe Leinen and then serve the respective convention, here the Greens. But when everyone sets off to occupy the building site illegally, The minister shuffles away wistfully. That is now over. And on the way back, when hundreds of police officers, water cannons flash in the fog, I feel like an old dog that hears the hunting horn but is no longer allowed to hunt. We drive away quickly before we succumb to our feelings. Conscious of its certain defeat, feeling fights against reason. It only takes up the fight to visibly and comprehensively stage the inevitable tragedy of pure perception for everyone. Partisanism, struggle, passion are the politician's element, writes Max Weber in Politics as a Vocation, the medium in which he creates the appearance that politics and the state are nothing but pure means to human ends. This method unites the apprentice and the statesman. But where the statesman uses this method in a sovereign way, Joschka Fischer uses the method for the purpose. What appears in the memoirs as self-confident cynicism appears in the diary as smug moralism. Joschka Fischer has the merit of having proved that the emotional life of a notorious green boy can also be utilized for state policy. From today's perspective, one is tempted to suspect that the entire student movement was invented only to illustrate a savings bank advertisement. The revolt was a complete success, especially for the 1968 heirs. The fact that they are spoken of today as the 48 heirs were at the time of the founding of the Reich is a sign of their breakthrough to a protected trademark, to a patent. The engagement has paid off twofold and threefold, and the political capital scraped together in the short course is paying off for the survivors of the movement with the interest and compound interest of political credibility. The ABC students of the basic course Wage, Labor and Capital from back then have crammed the one by one of political sovereignty summa cum laude. In retrospect, the movement appears to have been an intensive course in public relations, communication technology, and political management. What now seems to be running by itself still had to be laboriously improvised back then. An overview, the courage to leave things out, and a willingness to take risks were needed, qualifications that laid the foundation for both academic and political careers. Those who had not managed to learn the art of mobilizing and agitating in the anti-authoritarian movement, or who had not somehow learned the left-wing approach of combining scientific approaches with Marxism, had poor prospects in politics and science and had to become left-wing teachers. Those who then missed the next opportunity, who did not manage to gain a head start in recruiting and politicizing on the slippery slope of the so-called new social movements that ran down into the Green Party, fared even worse. The grammar schools were overcrowded with those entitled to a pension, and the universities were already overpopulated by comrades who wanted to teach Marxism and ecology, or alternatively linguistics, ethnology, or, like a former federal chairman of the MSB Spartacus, anthroposophy. Fortunately, Foucault, Deleuze, Derrida, the post-structuralists and other Heidegger followers came along. Those who did not want to give up during the long march to the founding of the anti-party party had to be as tough as a grassroots group meeting, as nimble as a city street hustler, and as hard as the district representative of the KBW. The elite who now took the lead had sufficiently proven that their awakening in '68 was not an external destiny, but an inner calling. In this, the dialectic of anti-authoritarian consciousness came to an end. It had mediated itself into a new political innocence and now appeared with the naive charm of immediate philanthropy. The unbridled emancipation egoism had refined itself into the right of the first land grab, Hans-Jürgen Kroll. The politics in the first person was perfected in the professional politician, for whom nothing takes precedence over himself. Nevertheless, a modicum of inner distance had to be present, a kind of roguish humor that was supposed to make people believe that politics was about higher purposes and was not so deadly serious. In addition to Joschka Fischer, Daniel Cohn-Bendit is inimitable at this art, who smugly annoyed another cultural revolutionary of the time with the question, "And you no longer fight against the state?" A "you" that melts on the tongue. The interviewee, Jerry Rubin, author of the Revolt bestseller Do It, had to come up with the truth. No, not anymore. That's unnecessary, it's the wrong fight. The state, I now have to become that myself, not me personally, of course, all of us. All of us from the 60s generation who now make up the masses of the 80s. The best and only way to fight the state today is to put ourselves in its place. And we are numerous enough, we, the bankers, doctors, dentists, entrepreneurs, the state that is us. Why should we fight against ourselves? This is the art of political communication, the program of the Wandervogel, elevated to a party, the Bundesjugend, to which one attaches oneself with all one's fiber, to tease out of the others. The modern professional politician, drilled in anti-authoritarianism, has learned to maintain a clear mass line while never committing himself irrevocably. He is flexible, knows how to distinguish between his supporting leg and his free leg, he does not get tangled up, and on the long run to himself he never lets himself be caught on the wrong foot. He alternately plays off the demands of the past against the reality of today, then again the party against the movement. He establishes himself as the all-encompassing mediator who, by virtue of his originality, holds the extremes together. This ingenious mediation between zigzag and general line was practiced in the talk of the unity of theory and practice, which the participants of party schoolings and the self-organized seminars under the direction of Wolfgang Fritz Haug, Joachim Hirsch and Elmar Altvater got drunk on. Contradictions were not an issue, because life itself held the whole mess together. And when Adorno spoke of the opiate of collectivity in 1969, in the marginal notes on theory and practice, his assessment of the protest movement, this judgment no longer concerned anyone who, with a distinctly anti-Semitic tone, had dismissed critical theory as out of touch, hostile to the people, and elitist. In 1968, people were opposing the emergency laws, denouncing the state as fascist and trying to virtualize the Germans' murderous collective of the Volksgemeinschaft through the phraseology of class society. Today they are tinkering with draft laws and praising parliamentarism to the skies. But only with mental reservation, of course. For example, a Green faction spokesman in the Bavarian state parliament said years ago, "If you rule out a revolutionary change in the medium term, we will also think about the time perspective that we can allow ourselves in view of the threat to our livelihoods." Quote end. One excludes, and we think about it. For example, about this, we have no reason to overlook the deficits of state action and the corruption of those in government. But it would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater to totally reject the state as such in today's world for this reason. End of quote. Despite all the individual criticism, in terms of the whole, it has to be constructive and pragmatic. It is only through criticism that participation at any price receives the higher consecration. Politicizing narcissism conceives of the state as such, pure sovereignty, as an inflated ego, as the idea and as the essence of reality. Abstracted from power and domination, the state appears exclusively as a composition of people and sincere communication. It appears as a therapeutic network. In the idea of the state as such, the concept of political progress is summarized as the rule of totalizing abstraction. The famous dictum "I am the state" of Louis XIV is realized at a higher level, a movement of negative dialectics that retrospectively denounces the revolt as unnecessary agitation and much ado about nothing. The absolutism of yore is reproduced as collective narcissism, as psychocracy and self-administration of the subalterns. A trained pastor, the former Maoist farmer representative Antje Vollmer, summed up this development on behalf of the heirs of '68 when she once stated in the Bundestag that the state is not something separate from individuals, a collective fundamental evil, but the state is us. Stalin never spoke more colorfully about the dictatorship of the proletariat. 40 years of '68 have fossilized the anti-authoritarian youthful transgressions of the past into German democratic senile stubbornness, and this end reveals the truth about the beginning. The heirs of the revolt will talk about anything because they have no intention of wanting to understand anything other than themselves. Their unconditional will to power, which the protest movement still had to keep secret from itself in the Leninist nagging question of what is to be done, was the catalyst for Germany's reparation. Thus, the left-wing radicalism of 1968 was by no means, as Lenin liked to think in a different context, a childhood disease of communism, but rather the abyss of Enlightenment betrayal that anyone who wants to achieve something in Germany must go through. Nonviolent, grassroots democratic, social and ecological social democracy has always been that. Nonviolent, its submissive respect for the state's monopoly on the use of force. Grassroots democratic, its loyal belief that only universal suffrage provides sovereignty with a real democratic foundation. Grassroots democratic, too, the slogan for the 1983 federal election. Do politics yourself in the future. Socially, the historical engagement for the welfare state's recognition of the value of simple work. Finally, the goodwill not to harm a fly, at most, like the comrade interior minister people. The sum of everything that is dear and precious to common sense, if it is only progressive, also represents the basic values of social democracy. The rise and fall of the Greens is a derivative phenomenon of the crisis of social democratic hegemony. With Willy Brandt, the pathos of social reform by the state came to an end even before the smooth transition to crisis management in 1974-75 embarrassed social democratic reformism as a mere verbal reflex of the student movement. It is understandable, then, that broad sections of the population, who had been agitated for the SPD by the SPD's slogans, refused to accept this rapid change and began to demand the program of social democratic awakening in the face of its consequent burial. They were post-materialistically oriented even before the word was invented. They not only took the university version of reformism, knowledge is power and equal opportunities instead of elite education, seriously as a possible compensation for economic inequality, but also sought their material livelihood through their engagement. Their clear conscience about promoting social and democratic progress and being promoted themselves, about being, first of all, public enemies in a professorial chair port, and secondly, obliging the state to thank them for it, revolted against its technocratic sellout. Only naked expert knowledge was to count, not the illusions of the experts. The social workers and psychotherapists, the student teachers of German and social studies in particular, began to become politically independent, tentatively at first. They decided to understand the social democratic turn as proof that the labor movement in general and the class struggle in particular were unworthy of them as individuals. The constitution of the new middle class into an autonomous party, which was thus initiated, accelerated through the citizens' initiative movement. It needed the experts along with their illusions. An unimagined labor market opened up, because the academics only had money in the form of their BAföG student loans and thus had to work off their new perspective by formulating ecology as the new leading science and worldview. The Green Party was founded to have this ideal denominator reimbursed in the cash of the election campaign costs. The politics of nature had the effect of a revolution on the market of those justifications of how the common good is to be placed before self-interest. Once present on the political market, it was immediately exposed to fierce competition. The green synthesis of particularistic egotisms now seems to be breaking up in this competition. The varnish is cracking and the asserted generality of the generic interest in survival is becoming, in the face of the economic crisis, precisely the ideology that it has always been. Roughly, 3 piles of debris can be distinguished. First, the folkish life reform spiritualist faction, which, depending on the interpretation of what the true needs might be, is once again breaking up into tribes, communes, and circles. The occult journal Neue Zeitung formulates its general denominator as longing for a revolution of the bowels, i.e. for a turning point that extends into the body's sensations. The world is to be saved and supreme fulfillment, created by the spirit-strengthened enjoyment of peristalsis. Naturally, social democracy has little more to offer this faction than the declaration that the problem is close to its heart. But it still takes on a competition for the last electoral vote and lets Oscar Lafontaine, the Albert Schweitzer of Saarbrücken, demand the somehow different progress. Politics should try to cover the detailed knowledge of the experts with a holistic view. Holistic, the password of the gastrointestinal revolution, is not bad at all. But Lafontaine goes further. The turning to life, the turning of the soul from selfishness to compassion, from having to being, is the central problem. Consequently, the social democratic connection to the German folkish tradition of the Spirit Revolution appears as a concrete utopia in the spirit of Ernst Bloch and socialism, as a resistance movement against the destruction of love. The Holy Family of the SPD, with Johannes Rau in the center like a statesman, flanked on the left by Lafontaine, Epler and Schroeder, and sitting on the right by Glotz, Rapp and Borner, also takes care of the second green faction, the eco-socialists, as if they were their own beloved voting cattle. Here it can be a little gram psi and a pinch of Euro-communism. Glotz, in particular, is aware of how much the left's relationship with the SPD is characterized by the assumption that social democracy is a party of dual character, of unholy indecisiveness between proletarian substance and bourgeois function. The New Left never got beyond Lenin's definition of the SPD as a bourgeois workers' party. Since the adherents of the dual character thesis can't help but locate the originators of the deviation from a proletarian substance in the bureaucracy, the opportunity arises to critically measure the bureaucrats' actions against the party conference resolutions and thus politicize the base. The Glotzian theory ragout of Marx, Gandhi and Gramsci will be welcomed by the eco-socialists as a sign of a left turn by social democracy. Finally, the radical democratic, realpolitik, eco-libertarian faction as the majority not only within the Green Party, but above all of its voters. Their politics and theory give a sense of the political sensitivity of leading social democrats. Willy Brandt's threat that there is a majority to the left of the governing coalition is now being taken as the truth, so the Jusos are standing outside the SPD and will reunite at 4.9%. In Hesse, the Jusos are playing their favorite game of casting the DGB's demands into law and thus trying to embarrass the government. It is this renunciation of the critique of political sovereignty, i.e., of the right as a derived function of power, that unites the Green majority with ecological social democracy and at the same time opens the hegemonic gateway for the SPD to enter the Green Party. The Greens assume that social democracy is capable of generating legitimacy solely through technocratic legality, through formalism under the rule of law as an end in itself. They counter this formalism with the politics of credibility, without realizing, however, that the very dualism of the legal and the violent state is rooted in the contrast between legality and legitimacy, the unity of which is state sovereignty. Legitimacy, derived from fictitious general class interests, revolts against mindless formal administration without wanting to realize that it is its doppelganger. The opposition of charisma to bureaucracy is a necessary condition for any power that wants to be based on the consensus of the subalterns. The Green Party's psychological view of society, which sets the scene for the politics of charisma, can only understand ideology as an expression of subjective intention, as an expression of personal opinion, as a mistake and an error, not as an objective and necessary form of movement in capitalist socialization. It is therefore doomed to fail. The social paradox that the social democratic concept of the formation of the political will, the addition of individual wills to sovereignty in the democratic election, is inverted and therefore exactly complementary to the conservative view of economic events. The addition of the atomized individual demand to the sovereignty of production is only duplicated in ecological terms. The bourgeois self-contradiction between the citizen as a competitive subject and agent of ruthless self-preservation on the one hand, and the citizen who is selflessly interested in the common good on the other, puts the Greens in a bind. The Greens' attempt to replace egoism with the general interest of the species reproduces egoism in a higher potency, without being able to satisfy it. As the party of citizens who are occasionally entrusted with productive tasks, social democracy is at least able to extract the odd compromise from its clientele with the argument that it represents social peace as a cost-saving factor in production. Socialism is democracy thought through to its consequent conclusion. The SPD's Commission on Fundamental Values formulates in its projections for the new program, democratic socialism strives for a socially just, ecologically responsible economic democracy in which the interest of the whole stands above the interest of the individual and every economic power must submit to public control. Non-violent, grassroots, social and ecological, the modernized SPD. The classic party of the as-if opposition was able to learn from the Greens the importance of a politics of charisma. Thus the new program, however it may differ in detail from the Godesberg program, is already suspended and the relationship trap for alternative criticism is installed, so that social democracy can say both a wholehearted yes to green utopia and a no to the Green Party. Socialism appears as the realization of those civil rights that real factory despotism posits as an ideological mirror image and complementary necessity of itself, in production, socialism as a watertight duplication of what is the case anyway. In this mirror game, political credibility is the seamless connection between reality and ideality, between democracy as current misery and path to utopia, the ticket to enter the political market. Participation in sovereignty can only be acquired at the price of playing this mirror game. Bourgeois rule is not organized by the apparatus of violence alone, but primarily through the contradictory, and therefore concrete identity of the splinters of reality and ideality distributed among the pluralistic parties. Ultimately, the parties are structured according to the aspects of crisis and the state of emergency. Where the left thinks in terms of economic crisis and collapse, it sees the state as a mere instrument, if only it were democratically constituted and a welfare state. Where the right thinks from the perspective of the coup d'état, it sees the economy as the neutral means of satisfying needs, if only it were depoliticized, a market economy, and rid of and divorced from the deepening of civil rights into production. This is the antagonism that the process of sovereignty guarantees as a synthetic unity of hegemony and coercion. The dilemma of the SPD is reflected in the social democratic offer of an antagonistic cooperation between capital and labor, in the attempt to once again take the famous reformist tightrope walk between storming of machines and coup d'état, and in the cardinal question derived from this, how do you avoid Chilean conditions? Glotz reflects the dilemma of the SPD. It faces a rival that it can outbid, the Green Party. But at the same time it is outbid by a conservative rival that tends to suspend democratic formalism. By conducting this competition only as a trench war, the classic formula of Karl Kautsky and the blueprint of January 30, 1933, that is, in the pious hope that the opponent may accept the social constitutional state as the clearinghouse of the productive factor social peace, with a chance of democratic change of power, it has recognized that it is below the level of its competition. The right is gradually abandoning the only political model that social democracy has at its disposal, the welfare state as the embodiment of what has historically succeeded what Godesberg still demands, the emancipation of the economic subject to the economic citizen. This nationalization of the working class, its negative but complete emancipation to self-conscious wage labor remains, in practice as well as in program, the last word of social democracy, even in a situation in which the right-wing ideologues of this warped emancipation as a frustration economy, George Gilder, have already prepared the end. The return of the good people of Godesberg thus signals the bleak renaissance of the moral victors of 1933, who could have been mistaken for Neanderthals and yet have passed this title on to the Greens. The latest fight for economic democracy will have a similar outcome to that of the 1920s. At the time, Fritz Naftali, the inventor of this political model, which was saved from the period of the Castle Peace over Weimar to Bonn, noted with satisfaction as a great victory that the trade unions were granted a say in the Frozen Meat Control Committee of the German economy. The most exciting event of the last Bundestag election campaign was an alleged fake scandal involving the CDU. Instead of using models or real people, the CDU had used staff from the Konrad Adenauer House for photo shoots for some election posters. Party colleagues had played the role of nurses or were dressed in police uniforms, prompting Jörg Radek, deputy federal chairman of the German Police Union, GdP, to protest in Bild with the words, "We are not props for election programs." Paul Ziemiak, general secretary of the CDU, countered the criticism with an argument that no one can contradict in these times. They had avoided shootings with professional models or actors in order to be able to comply with the strictest corona standards. In this way, the discrediting could not only be averted, but also turned into a moral surplus value. This resonated with motifs that also determined the election posters of most other parties represented in the Bundestag: the moralization of politics, the emphasis on seriousness and objectivity, which goes hand in hand with largely refraining from polemics against the opponent, as well as the hype surrounding facts behind which individuals have to take a back seat. One striking feature which characterizes the election posters to varying degrees is connected to this pathos of objectivity. Rarely have election posters been as iconographically unoriginal as they are this year. Where excessive polarization, the elaboration of contradictions and incompatibilities, seems to be self-prohibited in the face of an emergency affecting everyone, self-promotion is presented in an aerosol-dimmed way, so to speak, because any one-sidedness or hostility could be understood as a breach of the requirement to maintain distance. And in these times, what is required is not to emphasize differences, but to maintain the cohesion of the caring community, which sees itself as a modern form of a community based on solidarity. This redefinition of the caring society explains the strangeness of the fact that the topic that has been the dominant one for the past year and a half, the policy of measures in the fight against the COVID-19 virus, hardly appears at all in the party's election campaigns. To be more precise, it does appear, but not as a controversy on which a position would be taken, but almost secretly, in the respective accentuation of the posters. In doing so, the parties communicate a great deal about their self-perception. If one is to believe their self-representation, there is only one other New People's Party in 2021 besides the CDU, the Greens. They are already presenting themselves as the winners of the election, who, after taking office, will drag the Christian Democrats behind them as a senior partner. While the Social Democrats seem to have resigned themselves to their status as a small party, the Left Party, FDP and even AfD are acting modestly rather than openly oppositional. Apparently, no party wants to risk the accusation of violating political decorum. The CDU, whose election posters have been criticized by the Greens as being too white, still features representatives of ordinary citizens in its election advertising, unlike the other major parties. Children who go to school, people in normal jobs and pensioners who enjoy life in the countryside instead of mucking around in civil society. Under the slogan "Learn Today, What Counts Tomorrow," a schoolgirl with blonde hair is depicted. A poster for affordable housing shows a young, non-diverse nuclear family, and under the slogans "Do What Creates Jobs" and "With Security," women in traditional male occupations, police, technical and scientific research, are shown, who are also white. The coronavirus crisis is reflected in the selection of occupations without being mentioned. Law enforcement officers, technicians and nurses are among the occupational groups that have been celebrated as heroes of everyday life during the coronavirus pandemic from the outset. Doctors and medical professionals, in the form of gloved hands with syringes or test sticks, have been omnipresent in the media in recent months, but they do not appear on CDU posters or anywhere else. As personifications of the state of emergency, they would be indispensable in party advertising, but they would be a disruptive factor because they would remind people of the fear with which the health policy mobilization is being conducted. On the CDU posters, Armin Laschet, as an almost anachronistic embodiment of the father of the country, corresponds to the promise of bourgeois normality, in which everyone can make themselves useful for a fair wage and live pleasantly. Calm and composed, not averse to the pleasures of the flesh, with rosy cheeks and a paternalistic smile, he is more reminiscent of the Kohl era than of the present, helping to make us forget Angela Merkel, whose Protestant primness even her own party colleagues apparently want to forget. At the same time, Such traditionalism marks a disadvantage compared to the Greens, who stage themselves decidedly anti-white, megadiverse, and anti-patriarchal with a tendency towards megalomania. They are dominated by green, yellow, and pink, and instead of focusing on a single person, various party celebrities are depicted. While the CDU posters focus on representatives of different professions and generations, climate protection also appears here as part of their professional activities. The Greens only know morality instead of work. Instead of safeguarding specific living conditions, they are concerned with life as a whole, the ecosphere, the planet, or, as the party itself puts it, with everything. Where the CDU's slogan Deutschland gemeinsam machen, making Germany together, is slightly illiterately but popularly appealing, the Green slogans sound like a threat, bereit, while es side, ready because it's you, Deutschland. Alles ist drin, Germany. Everything is possible, alles ist möglich, everything is possible. Unlike the Christian Democrats, the Waiting People's Party no longer feels responsible only for the citizens of its own country, but for the world, and unlike the CDU, it no longer recognizes professional groups, but only the whole. At the same time, they are making the most aggressive switch from the coronavirus issue to the climate issue. The health crisis is not absent from the Green election campaign because it would be sensitive to talk about it, but because it is outbid by concerns about the health of the planet. Accordingly, the Greens present themselves as an intergenerational world protection community of women and men of diverse age groups, Baerbock, Habeck, Kretschmann, united by concern for the future of humanity. The SPD and the Left Party counter such a boastful habitus with a differentiated written language. The Social Democrats, who hardly anyone knows are still in government, are presenting themselves in a way that seems like a parody of their own image. Olaf Scholz in black and white against a bright red background, garnished with sentences like competence for Germany and respect for you, seems more like a compulsorily retired civil servant than a rival to Laschet as a father of the nation. Even the break essays, which are supposed to sound more serious than slogans, do not help. There is a clear reason why we want to lead the next government. Because we want to ensure more equality, without failing because of the resistance of a very conservative partner, is not more differentiated, but only more lengthy than the slogans of the CDU. Compared to such shamefacedness in the face of the fact that they help to bring about the conditions they claim to criticize, the Left Party appears to be the more honest original. Their posters are less red than those of the SPD, but they take up the experiences of the corona crisis from the point of view of more staff in care and health, and even adapt the title of Annalena Baerbock's election campaign book to give it a socio-political twist now. Together we are making the country fair. The widespread absence of party celebrities on the posters, which can be bought by the Left Party as a restriction on factual issues, is contrasted by the AFD's compulsion to depict their top candidates Alice Weidel and Tino Kruppala at least sometimes, while knowing that their physical presence is somehow perceived as a nuisance by many voters who need to be addressed. The AFD blue, which dominates the posters like abstract images, and the equally abstract slogan Germany, but normal are an expression of this avoidance strategy, which stands in remarkable contrast to the brutality with which the AFD has attacked the government's coronavirus policy in the Bundestag in recent months. In the face of so much discipline, the FDP's election posters, which show their model Christianländer in various relaxed poses under the maxim, "There's never been more to do," which alludes to the corona crisis in a comparatively clear way, as a shirt-sleeved doer and agile freelancer, chic unshaven bon vivant and meditative thinker, appear to be the most subversive contribution to the election campaign. Lindner's flagrant narcissism and the roguish and shady aspects of his self-presentation certainly contrast with the stuffy respectability that the parties are otherwise emphasizing in this election campaign. But unlike the CDU's election posters, this is probably just a successful fake. Are the Greens, of all parties, the new party of fat cats? According to a survey published by RTL/NTV Trend Barometer at the beginning of July, a majority of German citizens seem to think so. The survey found that 54% of those surveyed believe that the party is pursuing a policy for the upper echelons of society in terms of income and education. The metaphor of the party of bigwigs seems fitting in that the result of the survey was influenced by the particularly high level of skepticism towards the Greens among East Germans. Among them, 72% said that today's Greens are a party of the upper class. As is well known, there was also an upper class in the GDR, and its representatives were called Bonze by the population, a term that was used to denote their privileged position. This raises the question of what the unpopularity of the Greens in East Germany has to do with the history of the GDR and its impact on individual consciousness. There is another difficulty as well. By encompassing both economic and educational aspects, the notion of an upper class suggests that economic, political, and intellectual influence are necessarily interrelated and mutually supportive. However, this has never really been the case in Germany, and it is even less true today than it used to be. It is no coincidence that the Bildungsbürgertum is a specifically German category in social history, denoting the dissonance between economic and cultural significance on the one hand and political power on the other. Politically, this educated bourgeoisie was always largely without influence. It was characterized by an illusion of satiety and was secured by cultural as well as economic capital. But since the late 19th century, when its material basis began to erode, it was relegated to existing inheritances and possessions in order to maintain its standard of living. Such precariousness reinforced educational fetishism in this class, instead of contributing to a realistic judgment of its own economic situation, which, among other things, was reflected in an ideational exaggeration of the humanities and their graduates that is unique on an international scale. In the late 1920s, the sociologist Karl Mannheim coined the term free-floating intelligentsia to describe the milieu that emerged from the crisis of the educated bourgeoisie during the Weimar Republic. This milieu was characterized by the coming together of often unemployed academics, private scholars, wealthy but professionally unambitious sons of the bourgeoisie, and lumpen intellectuals. He was not only referring to the special opportunities that arose for members of this class from their social and intellectual independence resulting from their uncertain economic status, but also to the danger associated with it, namely, feeling like an intellectual avant-garde that condemns all common sense and bourgeois normality as bourgeois and wants to impose its own moral views on the majority of the population, which it regards as backward. 40 years later, in response to the failure of large sections of this intelligentsia in the face of Nazism, the sociologist Arnhelm Nussas, who had studied in Marburg with Heinz Mauss, a student of Max Horkheimer, and Horkheimer's opponent Wolfgang Abendroth, again took up the concept of the free-floating intelligentsia in his dissertation. He wanted to use it to analyze the new social movements that were gaining in importance and that invoked Herbert Marcuse and Ernst Bloch in order to revitalize utopian consciousness. It probably took a researcher trained in the thinking of both the New Left and its most outspoken critics to see the extent to which the movement from which the Greens emerged, with its mixture of precariousness, idealism, and political revolutionary claim to leadership, represented the legacy of the free-floating intelligentsia Mannheim recognized in its ambiguity. The current Greens differ from the early Greens in that the element of spontaneity and openness to experience, which at least in theory resonated in the invocation of utopian consciousness, has been completely extinguished in them. The environment, which used to be the focus of concern, has been replaced by cybernetic models of climate policy, for which the citizens, to whom the Greens used to claim to be close in a grassroots democracy, are only considered as potential disruptive factors. In the 1970s, utopia was already being invoked against all historical insight, with the crazy spontaneism of the human-dominant urge that many Greens, as former Maoists, were born into. The climate targets, green shrinking, degrowth, and CO2 neutrality are, as was previously the case with zero-COVID, technocratic totalitarian concepts for the liquidated utopia, from which every moment of the incommensurable and resistant has been taken and of which only the claim to human happiness remains. As a result, the free-floating intelligentsia has become an elite abandoned by intelligence, an upper class without a basis, so to speak, which, in the name of its moral claim to absoluteness, undermines the conditions for the possibility of its self-reproduction. It is therefore true that the new Greens are bullying the lower class and the middle class, which is in the process of descending. You can only get a correct ecological footprint with sufficient income. A balanced diet is expensive, you will have to be able to afford the looming energy and other prices, and the use of pronouns for fantasy and third genders are indeed pastimes for people who have not learned anything useful. At the same time, however, the new green policy is directed against both the service providers, that is, against the residuals of the middle class, who will provisionally ensure the illusory continued existence of bourgeois minimum standards in the service economy, infrastructure, and everyday culture for a few years, and against the remnants of bourgeois intellectuality at universities and in the cultural sector, thus just as much against the upper class. In this sense, today's green politics is not fighting any identifiable social class in the interest of another, but rather the entire bourgeois society and its inherently contradictory conditions of reproduction. That is why, in addition to the Zeitenwende turning point, the equally vaguely invoked war against the virus against climate change has become the guiding metaphor in recent years, the most effective synthesis of which so far is the fight against the right. Who the right-wingers are is at least as unclear as the question of who the free-floating elite is. It is an empty, but precisely for that reason useful, determination of the enemy, which can affect anyone, can be applied to anyone. and is necessary for survival for all those in whom hallucinatory wishful thinking has completely replaced the perception of social reality. Felix, a boy from a good family who is critical of global warming, does not like being fooled. I hate it when adults act as if they have a monopoly on the truth. After all, it is the adults who are responsible for the impending disaster, which, however, does not only cause him concern. Part of the country will flood, while the other will become a huge snow desert. But if it looks like the fields here, it's not all that bad. Aside from his taste for the apocalypse, which is not out of the ordinary in this country, the hero of the 2011 young adult book Wolfsnacht, Wolf Night, has no serious problems. That changes when a wolf comes dangerously close to him in the middle of the forest. Because Felix doesn't keep the little adventure to himself, the whole community soon learns about the problem wolf, who finally falls out of favor when he preys on the chickens of the local farmer shortly afterwards. Anger grows. The citizens arm themselves, and even the army moves in. Felix didn't want that. So he decides to protect the animal from the vigilantes, together with Leah, Cars Suck, and Dr. Koopman, a wolf expert hired by Greenpeace. The mission is a success. In the course of the rescue operation, the young animal lover proves to be a responsible problem solver who does not allow himself to be infected by Lee's radicalism. For example, we could puncture the tires of all police cars and army jeeps. In the end, harmony reigns, and Leah gives Felix a heart-wrenching gift. From the plastic bag, I pulled a backpack. It's bright yellow. And on the front, there's a wolf paw print. The story about saving a wild animal, which has been used for ages as a projection screen for nature enthusiasts, was thought up by the author couple Robert Habeck and Andrea Paluch, who specialize in youth political edification literature. In a world where conflicts can quickly escalate, the message is that it is important to take responsibility and show engagement in what you do, without going overboard. Then you will be rewarded with a happy ending. Here, parents from the German middle class have wrapped up their idea of the perfect children in a bland story. Constructive lateral thinkers who like to be outdoors, have a heart for animals, and instead of thinking about moving out of their parents' house, prefer to think about the future of the planet. The older generation with the false truths they are actively opposing are, of course, not their own mothers and fathers, but rather irresponsible egoists who would rather shoot the wolf than sit down at the round table. Committed students are currently demonstrating for climate protection every Friday, under the applause of the ecologically correct majority of this country, with slogans like "We are here, we are loud because you are stealing our future." The obsession with saving the planet has long since driven out of them not only any notion of reasonable advocacy, but also the carefreeness that once characterized youth. Instead, they give the impression of breath-envious early bloomers who lack the little self-respect that could prevent them from hanging around at climate demonstrations with the consent of their legal guardians. Their exaggerated concern for the future is an expression of the class standpoint of academic children, who have been greened early on, in whom the permanent stimulation of their egos has awakened the idea, inspired by their belief in their own self-efficacy, that the great creative tasks await them. Meanwhile, a glance at all the climate activists around them could make it clear to the more realistic among them that one should not expect too much from a future under such people, regardless of the weather. The sound for environmental engagement is no longer provided by Robert Habeck as a writer of young adult books, but as a green frontman. But the happy end slogans for the electorate are at least as kitschy as the educational principles from the wolf tale for adventure-seeking eco-kids. There is a longing for a politics that doesn't consider visions to be a swear word, a politics that moves people and takes them along, that makes democracy tangible. In his 2016 political autobiography, W.E.R. Wagt, beginnt. Die Politik und ich only in German, Habeck, who joined the Green Party in 2002 when he was already in his 30s, describes his politicization as a consequence of a productive crisis of meaning that made it clear to him that the binding force of my everyday life, my private inner cosmos, was no longer enough for me. So he was bored, which is why he decided to join the cool, Robin Hood-like pioneers for a better world. As a reminder, in 2002, the Red-Green coalition government had been in office for almost 4 years. In the wake of the Hartz IV reforms, the romantic do-gooders had launched a deeply illiberal, and precisely for that reason so well suited to genuinely social democratic mismanagement, a training program aimed at getting the human material up and running to upgrade Germany as a business location for the total world market. A second competition-neutral labor market was created, thereby degrading potential employees to semi-forced laborers and almsmen. This has nothing to do with capitalist exploitation, where the employee's share of surplus value is still up for discussion, but with a labor regime that is not liberal or conservative, but genuinely social democratic. Even the Greens' approval of the military destruction of Yugoslavia could have helped to make it clear at the time that the Greens are not primarily concerned with the revenge of the disinherited. Habeck's talent for positive thinking may have helped him to quickly become state chairman and, a few years later, environment minister in Schleswig-Holstein. He gave up this job as Minister for the Outside World, Habeck on Habeck, last year to take over the national leadership of the Greens together with Annalena Baerbock. Since his move into national politics, Habeck has been considered a political sensation. He inspires the audience, which is hungry for meaningful stories, not with content that is so irrelevant that it can be confidently neglected, but with his appearance. The man embodies a new style and speaks a different language than all previous politicians, it is said everywhere. Whether as eco-savior Hamburger Morgenpost, Green Swan Spiegel Online, or future Chancellor, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, Habeck is supposed to bring the divided country together again across the boundaries of the milieus. In short, Habeck works just as well in Prenzlauer Berg as he does in a Holstein cowshed. The label Minister for the Outside World contains a crucial component of his recipe for success. Habeck is seen as a doer who is not above donning a pair of rubber boots to solve local problems. He combines an existential worldliness with an emergency jargon, in crises, the hour of the political strikes, that is supposed to emphasize that his political engagement stems from the deeper layers of meaning of our existence. Habeck doesn't just have political interests, he feels no less than a longing for the sea in what he does. He rejects the relativity of anxious groping, quite unnoticed. He ties in with a very German tradition that says, if you want to live, you have to knuckle down. He enriches the green-painted power-through joy gesture with the most shameless kitsch, which begins with the longing for the sea and reaches its goal between dead sperm whales on the North Sea coast, which helped him decide to run for party leadership. Quote, but now, here in the mudflats between the dead whales, what is right and important is sorting itself out again. End of quote. Peddling one's own sensitivity is not perceived as intrusive chumming up to the esoterically susceptible, simply because contemporary politics has long since merged with the grand emotions that everyone wants to have. The emphasized sensitivity also serves the viral mass need for sensitive masculinity, which may also come across as a morbid obsession with dead animals, as long as the respective self-staging remains recognizable as a confession of one's own weakness by the one who, even when poorly shaved, appears not as a rough guy, but as a soft mop of hair. A recent article in the Süddeutsche Zeitung reported that current photographs of male actors and pop stars show a completely new look. The new man no longer looks down from above, but as if you have just raised your bowed head to look a bit embarrassed, a bit enigmatic at the camera. Photos of Habeck, in which his pensively bowed head and whimsical gaze are intended to convey a weighty mind and sociability, testify that the image transformation we are talking about here has also reached professional politics. However, the womanizer politician build can do more than just look cute. He listens and thinks before he says anything. He has trained his intellect on great philosophers like Immanuel Kant. End of quote. There is no chance that the celebrated man could be embarrassed by the adulation, because he himself doesn't do it under Kant either. I know that I don't know everything better. Kant taught me criticism and Camus taught me doubt. End of quote. There is talk with Karl Kraus that classical education sometimes illustrates above all the banality of the schmuck who constantly parades it. Accordingly, Habeck professes in a gesture of arrogant modesty, maybe it's because I've read too much Hegel, but I firmly believe that behind a seemingly random and incoherent series of events, there is often a common explanation. End of quote. Mind you, such sentences do not introduce a quote or philosophical digression, which would not make it any better, but serve exclusively as self-promotion. Habeck even manages to interpret the banal fact that his initial reluctance in the struggle for the party leadership did not harm him in the end as negative dialectics at work. It is remarkable that there are no doubts about the intellectual abilities of the great thinker, even when his intellectual self-testimonials, widely rolled out to the public, sound as if they were the bumbling attempt of a philosophy student to hit on his fellow student, who always sits in the front row in a Hegel seminar. The half-educated show-off with Kant, Hegel and company turns them into set pieces of an unrestrained political self-marketing strategy that testifies to the fact that a particularly devious careerist is hiding behind the displayed bookishness. The question of whether Robert Habeck is being celebrated as the man of the hour despite or because of his exaggerated self-confidence in intellectual circles cannot be answered conclusively. In any case, his atypical CV, a doctorate in a literary subject and working as a writer, i.e. basically the fact that he has learned nothing at all, is seen in the arts pages as an aptitude that puts him ahead of other politicians. Because everything will change radically in the coming years, the literary politician Volker Weidermann could put his narrative skills entirely at the service of political moderation and provide the hands-on part of society with motivational aphorisms, speculates Tobias Haberkern in Die Zeit. The suggestion that politicians should be brought on board, whose talent for smearing together half-baked fictions enables them to counteract the mood of crisis through discourse therapy, speaks to an understandable lack of confidence that also characterizes the mood in the upper classes. The dissatisfied could be dealt with on their own, but now even the well-meaning are showing the first signs of fatigue. As Claudia Seidel writes in the FAZ, since the AfD, in its chavvy way, has been attacking and berating the establishment for its very existence and the elites for their supposed aloofness so radically, the bourgeois public has got into the habit of defending the immanence of political thought and the empty phrases and narrow-mindedness of political language against the populists, as a necessary evil in the process of democratic compromise and consensus building. Habeck, whose language is able to view the political sphere from the outside, reminds this audience once again how great the yearning was just a few years ago for German politicians to be able to imagine an outside, a beyond, to politics itself. In view of the state of the German post-bourgeoisie, one would have to be crazy to think that the middle-class audience would have begun to defend the prevailing order and the phrases that support it only out of self-defense, while one should imagine the parliamentary routine before the AfD as a civilized interaction in which the citizens and their politicians were allowed to serve the true, the good and the beautiful undisturbed. But that is what Claudius Seidel, head of the feature section of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Sonntagszeitung, wants. He is so offended by the attacks on government policy that he would prefer to abandon politics altogether. The desire for a beyond politics that Habeck promises is based on the realization that in direct political dispute with the irreconcilable mob, one can only lose because what bothers them cannot be reasonably defended. That is why the rhetorically disarmed continuation of the political and economic course should be about the general public, with the hope that there will be less rumbling. How can you rail against political decision-makers who have no problem producing losers, but also remain human in the face of these difficult times? Or, to put it in Habeck's incomparable words, politics is knowing that political decisions change people's lives, and not everyone wins, and that we still have to look the losers in the eye. End of quote. The constant production of symbolic recognition is intended to erase the awareness that it should only be about material improvements. The priestly pity tour also serves the purpose of making all those who can well do without it look them in the eye and make them feel guilty. Because anyone who remains cold despite the nicest offers of dialogue reveals themselves as an enemy of democracy. A sense of pride in not belonging is beginning to erode our democracy. Quote end. In his latest work, Why We Could Be, Why Our Democracy Needs an Open and Diverse Language, Habeck explains why the reliably illiterate political class, of all things, should suddenly be concerned with language. Instead of talking to each other, he says, mutual slaughter is booming. The advance of populism's language of battle is problematic because speaking is not just a matter of manners. Rather, language constitutes reality. How we speak determines who we are, and who we can be. End of quote. He's not entirely wrong. After all, Habeck himself repeatedly illustrates in his speeches that he is as stupid as he sounds. At a time when party politics is considered ugh and bleh, 1,000 delegates are sitting here full of attention and concentration. This service to democracy is quite great. We will rock you. Quote end. What is striking about the disparity between aspiration and reality in one's own language practice is that those who most lachrymose lament the decline of language always only mean the language of the others, who lack education, but above all the willingness to engage in dialogue. The pedagogical view of the underclass obscures the fact that the regression of language ability has non-linguistic reasons that are related to the powerlessness and dependency to which individuals are condemned. On closer inspection, the complaint about the decline in language is not about language or its social conditions at all, but about the fear that the rallying cries of the ruling politics will no longer have an integrative effect even if they are refined in a socio-pedagogical way. The audience for the communication kitsch that Habeck represents is only seemingly the underdogs. It has become clear that some of the population can no longer be reached with either pedagogy or insults. This makes it all the more important that this section of the population is either silenced or declared a bunch of dangerous weirdos. Even Habeck cannot avoid speaking of those, of course, right-wing populist armies of trolls who have all day to let loose their insults. The hype around talking to each other proves to be a public soliloquy of the academic middle class, which presupposes the conviction of all participants that everything should remain the same. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to diagnose that the way of downward communication, the principle of carrot, looking the defeated in the eye, and stick, an army of trolls, represents the sometimes more and sometimes less conscious attempt to silence dissent through self-referential communication. Ulrich Enderwitz observed this more than 20 years ago, at a time when questions of communication were not yet at the center of political discourse. And indeed, communication is nothing more than the sacrosanct agreement made in objectu and the sworn statement made in rebus not to engage in any kind of objective debate, not to want to talk about the matter under any circumstances. End of quote. The framing manual, which provides ARD executives with rhetorical tricks to help them seal their own sense of moral superiority against criticism, is just one particularly brazen current example of the manipulative nature of the prevailing political communication. Habeck, who recommends that his readers be more sensitive to language and review their previous lines of argument, shares the view of the author of the manual, the eccentric language expert Elizabeth Welling, that linguistic interpretive sovereignty is a central factor in securing power. Unlike Welling, whose recommendations "we take everyone seriously, even your grandmother or we are you," make it clear that providing services to secure power in the long term makes you stupid, Habeck, who values contact with people, largely avoids a do-gooder slang that tends towards open madness. Rather, he suggests that everything can be talked about without naming the unequal conditions for participating in that conversation. The communicative misery, which is particularly oppressive where the communicators believe that their babble will make the world a better place, should not obscure the fact that language has an inherent utopian potential that is systematically undermined by postmodern linguistic idealism. Language is not a free product of the individual, Wilhelm von Humboldt. Rather, it presents itself to individuals as a binding system whose signs, meanings and rules they have to appropriate, but whose objectivity they deform concepts, to grasp objects and facts of external and internal reality, to communicate meaningfully and to tap into the objectified content of experience in language, in order to also help express what is missing. Marx was concerned with the social character of language and summarized its dual character. Language itself is as much the product of a community as it is in other respects itself the existence of the community and the self-speaking existence of it. Marx/Grundrisse der Kritik der politischen Ökonomie. As the self-evident existence of society, it is not identical with the state of development of the material conditions that prefigure it. However subjectivist the approach to language, it refers independently of the intention of the speaker to the general, and thus to the idea that those who communicate with each other could jointly arrive at the insight to collectively interrupt the fatal course of things. The ability to distinguish between true and false is the condition for radical critique aimed at change. Truth is nothing other than the epitome of the negation of what is false. Those who, like Habeck, do not want critique, but productive engagement under exploitative conditions that remain the same, have no ally in truth, but a feared opponent. In the introduction to his doctoral thesis, Habeck states that the question of truth is not relevant when evaluating works of art. Rather, as with relaxation music and healing stones, it is a matter of consistency, intensity, and interpretative power. Habeck/The Nature of Literature. Today, almost 20 years later, the truth is still one of the unreasonable demands that torment him. Various variations of the following sentence are part of his spoken and printed standard repertoire. Anyone who believes they are in possession of the truth has not understood what democracy is. It is not about truth, but about arguments. Grunblatter, Member Magazine, 2018. One wonders where the passion comes from in the face of the same old attacks, since no one except the Pious Brothers and the MLPD claims to be in possession of the truth anyway. It can't be just courage for free. It is more likely to be the narcissistic rage at the mere idea that the current chatter could be rejected as false. Where truth is said to be an expression of arrogance and the result of a false understanding of democracy, there is neither false consciousness nor a false order. Delighted by their avowal that they don't want to offend anyone with too much love of truth, the bourgeois audience acknowledges that the Green Party has matured, and that quirks such as the K-group-like know-it-all behavior and stubbornness in discussions and the tendency to patronize, which had previously prevented adequate cooperation, have come to a well-deserved end with Habeck. The beginning of this wonderful friendship sounds like this. They radiate neither brooding nor leftist doggedness. They seem like optimists who always greet the new day cheerfully. End of quote. Understandably, the Greens are not giving up the habitus of the protest party in times when infantile rebellion is booming. They simply invent a suitable slogan, which in this case is, "Radical is the new realistic." In fact, the Greens can easily fall back on their fundamentalist past when radically defending the status quo. The anti-civilization frugality that they exemplified as an alternative minority while eating grains and building tree houses is now required of everyone. The Greens can rightly claim to be the chosen ones when it comes to radically advocating for renunciation for the benefit of higher powers. In this way, they are trying to create the impression that they are no longer a party of prohibition, but people with whom you can talk about anything. Instead of either/or our world is often a matter of either/then, is the mantra that is supposed to dispel any suspicion that these people are truth fanatics. The aim of the heckling, Franz Joseph Degenhardt, is to make ever greater impertinences appear as viable options. Incidentally, Habeck has created a monument to a pragmatist of power who also dealt with the political on the one hand and the other. He is referring to the social democrat counterinsurgent Gustav Noske, whom Habeck portrays as a tragic hero in his play Nuns and Oxen, which is about the Kiel sailors' revolt. When he speaks of Noske, one might get the idea that Habeck is referring to himself. Noske is also a reflection of the tragedy in politics. Often enough, it is caught in a dilemma and has to decide, even if there is no good decision, only the choice between bad and perhaps worse. End of quote. In response to the enthusiasm for the Green Party leader, the conservative political clown Jan Fleischhauer published a polemic on Spiegel Online on January 17, 2019, in which he asks, "Where do you learn to talk like that? Not even 12 years of Waldorf plus Montessori is enough, and Habeck wasn't even at a Waldorf school," whereupon Fleischhauer comes to the conclusion that the only weakness of Germany's green pain in the neck is the absence of any dark thought. This may be the kind of humor that appeals to Fleischhauer's readers, who think they have the dark thoughts that the naive do-gooder lacks, which is generally enough to see themselves as free-thinking adventurers. But Fleischhauer is right on one point. To date, there is no valid argument for the euphoric reactions to Habeck's drivel. But what the biggest windbag in the country might not have in mind is not the point. The popularity of the Green Firebrand is helping his party to succeed, which is already part of several state governments and is well on its way to establishing itself as the political force dominating discourse in German cities. And that is where the fun stops, if not before. This is because the Greens, despite or perhaps because of their reactionary ideas about order, their academic urban social chauvinism and their postmodern partisanship for German capital, are treated gently across the board. The fact that green policies are currently a no-brainer is also because green basic issues such as health, the environment and diversity shape the everyday life of postmodern society from kindergarten on. The former social outcasts are now trusted to modernize Germany in an ecologically correct way. Their idea for modernizing the country is sustainability, a green instead of an industrial gray capitalism. More decisively than the other parties, the Greens are willing to forego the potential right-wing vote in order to score all the more with the broad masses of the average anti-fascist voter. By sticking to the status quo and defending everything the AfD electorate is revolting against, the Greens have become the most popular opponent of this problematic party. They are the only party that has been represented in the Bundestag for some time that is benefiting from the political polarization. Climate policy, which the Greens are pushing most radically, reveals the insane character of Germany's world-saving ambitions. In terms of energy policy, Germany is focusing on global markets for the expansion of sustainable energy sources and the associated technologies. The current boom in orders from German wind turbine manufacturers, who are wrestling with their Chinese competitors for global dominance in this sector, confirms that ecology can achieve more than just ideological surplus value. Consequently, efforts are also being made to impose the energy transition on other countries in order to sell them the cleanest green electricity in the world as soon as possible. Economic speculation, which to a certain extent can claim a calculative rationality, is increasingly being overlaid by the quasi-religious desire to save the climate in a way that sets an example in world politics, thus serving a higher purpose in a very German manner and gradually succumbing to frenzy in the process. Thus, the existing energy supply is being replaced by an economically less efficient form of energy without any consideration for economically comprehensible considerations. This new form of energy is, firstly, more expensive for the end consumer despite massive subsidies, and secondly, it is impossible to say whether it can be used to ensure that national energy supply remains at least at the same level. The consequences of dismantling key industries will make prices unaffordable for many consumers. The fact that an unprecedented eco-economic intervention in the private sphere is being pushed forward and accepted on the basis of arbitrary benchmarks and grotesque demands for bans, while the social situation continues to deteriorate, testifies to the amok character of climate policy. Incidentally, wind power is not particularly ecological. Large areas of land are sealed for wind farms, with negative consequences for the groundwater. Their noise scares away animals, the rotor blades kill birds and bats, and the towers are made of steel, which is produced with heat from coal or natural gas. They are also an aesthetic imposition. Wind turbines spoil the landscape, and to make matters worse, due to their height, they can be seen from far and wide, unlike nuclear or coal-fired power plants. In view of all this, their reputation is surprisingly good. Nothing else is talked about as much as the destruction of nature, yet people are about to fall prey to it completely. The current general mobilization is by no means about the relationship between humans and nature, but about the unconditional submission of frightened humanity to the lofty goal of saving the climate. Where topics such as climate protection or healthy living determine public discourse, the problem is not the wrong social relationship, but the human being as a risk factor, who, as a parasite, endangers both the planet and the future of coming generations. For large parts of German society, saving the world's climate still has a narcissistic appeal. But that could change quickly. The political and economic impositions are becoming more tangible, but have objectively long since ceased to be communicable, which is why politics must increasingly master the art of storytelling. The rhetorical soundtrack for this is what Habeck strikes up at every opportunity. In the face of the fear of loss of control and the imponderable, we no longer face the open and existential. End of quote. What is meant is the blind trust in the course of things, the glossing over of which is to be understood as an undisguised threat. To make means to interfere, to make means to fight, to make means pain, but we laugh at this pain. End of quote. This pathos of construction, which affirms those social developments that drive decay, is the flip side of sensitive drivel and mobilizes the worst instincts of the growing number of good people who get teary when they think of the climate, but who have only laughter for the self-mutilation of humanity. But even the painless sometimes lose their laughter. After criticism of his announcement that he would make Thuringia an open, free, liberal, democratic state, which some saw as a bit megalomaniacal, Habeck simply logged off of Facebook and Twitter. Like all postmodern spokesmen, the emotional man from the eco-bourgeoisie is prone to offended withdrawal when the applause fails to materialize. And that gives us hope. On March 11, 2021, the weekly newspaper Die Zeit dedicated a special dossier to Robert Habeck, who at the time was neither federal minister of economics nor vice-chancellor, but only federal chairman of the Green Party. Under the headline Is It Still Him? Political editor Robert Posch explored how Habeck, who rose to prominence by being different, but is now being mocked for his intellectual posturing, is overcoming this identity crisis. The accompanying large-format black-and-white image, showing Habeck portrayed by photographer Vera Taman on March 3, 2021, is more of a PR piece of art than a mere illustration, with his right elbow as casually as thoughtfully, wearing a smart but casual jacket and sporting the inevitable designer stubble of the perceived freelancer. Habeck looks serious, focused, but also somehow distant and a bit vulnerable, in the direction of the viewer and past him at the same time. Without having read a single line, the recipient understands. This is about someone who overlooks the individual only because he always has the big picture in mind. About someone whose decisions are not right or wrong, but arrested from the inner contradictions of a green conscientious objector, who makes them after wrestling and struggling in solitary decision and thereby lends them unbreakable authenticity. He is a man so deeply scarred by life that he only rarely offers a smile to those around him. A man who, even when he seems to be doing nothing, is constantly at work and therefore cannot waste his precious time on a daily shave. In the Zeitdossier, Habeck is also portrayed in the introduction as a profound loner with a brooding sense of civic duty. When Posch observes him in an everyday situation with a Beckett touch, "Why," the man calls, half-empty vodka bottle in hand, "why, you're the thing." He looks at his friends searchingly. Then he calls out, "It's Habeck." For a moment, Robert Habeck seems to be wondering whether to continue walking. Habeck stops. He turns around. "Joe," he says. That Habeck is someone with a heart for ordinary people, someone who repeatedly interrupts his walks through the metropolis to call out a "yo, dude" or "hey" to the youth skating around or the drunk on the park bench from a condescending eye level, is an integral part of Habeck's cover iconography. In February 2019, the Interview magazine Galore put him on the cover in the pose of the whimsical and vital Joe, shirt sleeves rolled up, elbow propped on the table, and as always unshaven. He runs his hand through his tousled hair and for a change, shows the viewer his teeth while laughing. The headline from a corresponding interview unexpectedly certifies the country, which Habeck, according to his own earlier statement, never really got to grips with, as the best republic we've ever had. The question of whether this is an encouraging judgment in view of German history is not asked. The cuddly doer, who smiles at the reader as if they were an old buddy, jovially dispels any doubt. But as I said, as an authentic wrestler, Habeck rarely allows the audience to see such a smile. Especially since he has held the office of minister and vice-chancellor, the media present him as a warrior who only tackles his tasks so well because he penetrates them ontologically. On May 29, 2019, the magazine Stern had presented a determined Habeck, looking resolutely out over a distant horizon in a wind and weather jacket, with the question, "Our next chancellor?" He seemed destined for leadership precisely because he was more suited to being a sea and mudflat hiker than as a pencil pusher, The magazine changed tack after all and appointed Habeck, no longer in the guise of an adventurer, but as a seriously styled bon vivant, as the true chancellor. At least that's how Stern View titled the vice-chancellor almost exactly 3 years after the mud-flat hiker picture. He explains he is determined, he gets down to business, why Germany's well-being now depends on him. A month earlier, Stern had already put Habeck on its cover, not looking towards the horizon, but staring straight at the viewer, but with a similar mixture of foresight and depth. This time under the headline, The Helmsman, a Tough Job, How Robert Habeck Wants to Save Our Prosperity. The Habeck character differs from the type of brutal practitioner who prefers to act rather than hesitate and to help in the here and now rather than to wander into the distance, in that he is still looking for the root of the problem everywhere, even in the midst of the daily political melee, like a climate-neutral, Jason Heidegger. He thinks further, goes deeper and feels more intensely than opponents and fellow campaigners. What distinguishes him from Christian Lindner was summed up by the magazine Der Spiegel in November 2021 with the headline, There Can Be Only One, Money or Climate. How the alpha males Habeck and Lindner are eyeing each other up. The cover showed, each half-cropped, the faces of Habeck skeptically eyeing his competitor and a somehow sly and mean-looking Lindner, who is even more unshaven than Habeck but still looks like a big business owner and will never be able to copy the combination of earthiness and future orientation that the Green Party member radiates. What else could you expect from someone who is more concerned with money than with the climate and who puts material needs before sustainability? The fact that Habeck does not do this, but instead puts his whole self into the job, as the embodiment of hand, heart and mind, disdainfully putting aside vested interests in the name of planetary and health protection, is what gives his charisma its unique radiance. Unlike Lindner and unlike Olaf Scholz, the personification of anti-charisma, Habeck tackles things and explains them at the same time, not only doing a tough job but also, as the helmsman, being responsible for the long-term vision that dominates almost every Habeck cover. This is only possible because, as the Spiegel headlined on August 20, 2022, he is not only a leading figure, but also a suffering figure. A moment of solemn lament is an essential part of the existentialist's habitus, which, of course, must not become whining. How Robert Habeck Wins Over Germans in a Crisis was the Spiegel headline about the suffering figure, showing a slightly worried, somewhat sour-looking vice-chancellor who can be seen not to let himself go even when he takes even shorter showers than usual due to hard times. What's left now? Robert Habeck is under pressure, ran the headline of the September 1, 2022 issue of Zeit, in view of inflation and rising energy prices. The cover photo showed Habeck, his white shirt wide open at the collar, looking a little unshaven than usual, wandering thoughtfully and wearily through a field of wheat. When he is going through hard times, the existential political wrestler does not turn into an angry lout, but rather into a melancholic. He seeks solace in nature, to which alone he feels bound by his mandate, withdraws and takes himself to court before consulting with others who have previously undergone a similar inner examination. Since identity crises and ostentatious brooding are part and parcel of the social character of postmodern, mindful masculinity, as embodied by Robert Habeck, the public is more patient with him despite his blatant failures, gas levy, than it would be with less contemporary types. Nevertheless, his image is showing the first scratches. Robert Habeck's reaction to the gas levy embarrassment is revealing. When he complains about companies making a lot of money, and complains that the trouble has spoiled his day, it's not just the content that's brash. It is typical of a brutal new political jargon. When members of the federal government met in disguise and at a distance during the past 2 years to discuss future citizen harassment, and when they said goodbye to each other instead of shaking hands, the observer sometimes had the slight suspicion that these people were communicating with each other not like members of a government, but like members of a gang. 2 years later, the language of crooks and gutter language has become common practice in Parliament, after it became increasingly clear in recent weeks that the gas levy for large energy companies, for which Economics Minister Robert Habeck was responsible, in some cases acts like an excess profit bonus from which companies benefit while citizens have to pay hundreds and hundreds of euros extra for their energy consumption. Habeck now went public with a conformist, buddy-buddy statement. In it, he promised to examine the solidarity of the agreement with the gas companies and moderated his plan to make citizens pay for the federal government's energy policy through compulsory levies, with the words, "Nevertheless, we naturally have a political problem, which has really soured my day over the last 48 hours. It is certainly not morally right for companies that, let me put it in low German, have made a pile of money, than to say, yes, and for the few losses of revenue that we have, we ask the population for help." The idea of garnishing the mockery of citizens in terms of energy policy with emotions against the powers that be who, to put it in low German, make a fortune, while the electorate, whose interests they no longer even pretend to represent, unfortunately have to make do with less. You have to have a lot of nerve to come up with such a brazen idea. But Habeck's use of the same rude egalitarian form of address with the powerful as with the people shows that he is also prepared to snub the people in the event of grassroots democratic protest, instead of taking them seriously. In the same vein of authoritarian equality, he had previously announced with regard to compensation for rising energy prices. And if someone says, "I'll only help if I get another €50, then I'd say, "You're not getting it, dude. Dude, I'm not helping you, dude. Don't piss me off, dude. You're making a shitload of money." This jargon, in which proximity to the people and subservience to authority, obedience, and the desire to rule merge, is increasingly revealing itself as the new language of German democracy. It is the language of those who have little power but still know that they are the movers and shakers. They address the population as a collective, with whom one is patient as long as they comply, but can be harsh in the event of recalcitrant opposition. It is the language of a postmodern authority that fancies itself close to the people, which, as soon as it encounters opposition, reacts in a passive-aggressive manner like a narcissistically offended toddler. When Focus magazine, under the title Wirtschaft im Sturm, Economy in Turmoil, put a conventionally disheveled, impatient-looking Habeck over a faltering skyline, this staging was less reminiscent of a hike in the countryside than of Godzilla's devastation. Such iconography, showing the far-sighted wrestler as a destroyer, captures what Habeck himself has not yet said a word about, the destructive self-contradiction of his understanding of the office. Anyone who is a climate minister with heart and soul naturally always runs the risk of being the minister of economic destruction rather than the minister of economic affairs. Therefore, Habeck's existentialist habitus has an inherent tendency towards chaos, which should frighten rather than encourage citizens. Poverty can be a luxury, but acquiring it is particularly expensive at the upmarket mail-order company Manufactum, founded by former Green Party politician Thomas Hoof. Here, members of the ecologically aware middle class can buy hand-woven flannel shirts, hand-carved pinewood Easter eggs, and hand-polished stainless steel milk pots, the possession of which gives authenticity to the conviction that frugality can also make you happy. Manufactum customers are also better prepared for the coming Habeck winter than lateral-thinking Wutberger. For the bargain price of €79.90, for example, you can purchase a heat composter there, which the catalog lyric praises as follows: enclosed, well-insulated and optimally ventilated compost containers like this one made of recycled plastic, temperatures of up to 70 degrees Celsius are reached in summer. Even in the winter months, the temperature usually never drops so far that the rotting process comes to a halt. Hot composters are the ideal alternative to open compost heaps for smaller garden plots because they require less space and the rotting process is faster. End of quote. Where the account is in the black, the property is secure and the next vacation in Canada is booked. Compost-based self-sufficiency presents no difficulties, and the admonition that it is not so bad to make do with less comfort for a few years passes over the lips without resistance. The social conscience, which has always been as much a part of the Green Party's moral self-image as its distancing itself from the base interests of workers, is not rooted in any valid understanding of social freedom and equality, but in the insecurity that the noble renunciant always feels when his self-imposed asceticism is disturbed by encounters with poverty that he has not chosen himself. Basically, the green-clad man thinks to himself, deprivation and drive Protestantism are a good thing, it's just a shame that those who have less than you are so difficult to convince of this. The precarious middle class would rather fill their rented apartments with cheap kitsch and knickknacks than recognize the promise of happiness in minimalism and objectivity by doing without lavish interior design, and lower-class girls twerk on TikTok instead of learning about the advantages of vegan face creams. This kind of elective affinity between luxury and austerity, prosperity and asceticism fits well with a deeply rooted conviction in Germany that true warmth of heart thrives best under poor living conditions. Where prosperity is taken for granted, however, the conspicuous consumption described by the American sociologist Thorstein Veblen, the communication of wealth through gestures of generosity and freedom from purpose, is frowned upon, and a specific mixture of moralism and asociality develops, which is not only part of the green social character, but also of green politics. Only such a policy makes it possible for a Minister of Economics to openly admit, in the face of the current energy crisis, which is in fact an energy supply crisis, that he first has to get an overview of the complex infrastructure. We didn't know how intertwined the gas market is, and therefore relies on chance and fate, a bit of luck with the weather, instead of instrumental reason, as do all true believers, in order to get through the winter without a supply collapse. The tone of Habeck's pronouncements is not that of a political representative elected by the sovereign for a limited period of time, who is obliged to the general public and required to act in the name of this general public, sometimes against his own preferences, and to put aside obscure hobbies in favor of his official duties. It is much more the gesture of the heat composting manufactum customer, who looks up into the sky with concern during his weekly walk around his property and hopes that the solar-powered liquid manure converter continues to perform at full power. It is the gaze of a social class that has forgotten the foundations of its living conditions because it is so rarely forced to deal with them. However, the politics that this moralism has given rise to is no longer directed only against the economically marginalized. Rather, the middle class, which has traditionally been the subject of a cult in Germany, has also been targeted for a long time. They in whom, according to the self-representation of the old Federal Republic, the warmth that cannot be found in anonymous society should flourish in partnership, family and business, are now being asked to adapt their everyday lives to a symbolic winter war mode. When there is a war, blackouts are the order of the day. Warmth is provided not by the central heating but by candles, which the home front fighters spending the winter together watch with stirring devotion as they drip, pondering the transience of all living things. For poverty is a great radiance from within, wrote Rainer Maria Rilke in his 1905 book, The Book of Hours. 10 years later, Rilke would become one of the most fanatical war enthusiasts among German-language poets. The idea that the warmth of community is only kindled under conditions of scarcity and gloom, that people only find their way to one another authentically in suffering and adversity, was a theme of the German national war euphoria at the beginning of the First World War, which could be reactivated 20 years later to great popular effect. The warm glow that radiated from poems like Rilke's did little to conceal the fact that the advertising of cozy get-togethers in times of physical pain and emotional distress was in fact giving way to barbarism, powerlessness, and coldness on a scale that the concrete jungle of the Weimar Republic had not allowed. The counterimage to the coldness propagated under the alibi of an emergency-born sense of community is not the manure-heated, communally administered farm, but rather the urban civilization that does not need any autosuggestively generated sense of community because its cosmopolitan, casual coldness enables social interaction. However, this requires a bourgeois state that ensures the infrastructural and economic conditions for such sociability in a cost-effective, routine, and reliable manner. But things don't look good in this regard at the moment. A future citizens' movement that fought for the restoration of such minimal conditions for successful socialization in a combative and friendly manner could draw on a maxim with which Karl Kraus defended the alliance of urbanity and civilization against all future compost heaters and high-rise roof greeners in 1912. I demand the following from a city in which I am supposed to live: asphalt, street cleaning, house keys, central heating, hot water. I am a homebody myself. To get an idea of how Winfried Kretschmann, even a washcloth is a useful invention, and Bettina Jarasch, I just do a quick wash and go in the morning, imagine the future, it is advisable to consult the Wikipedia entry for the keyword washcloth. There you can read the following: a washcloth, also known regionally as a soapcloth or washcloth, is a piece of fabric for personal hygiene that is more than the size of a hand. In Europe, it is sometimes also designed as a rectangular wash glove that a hand can slip into. The material is different, but cotton-containing terry cloth is often preferred. For hygienic reasons, 2 washcloths are always used to wash clients in professional geriatric and nursing care. For intimate care, dermatologists point out that it is better not to use conventional washcloths for intimate hygiene because they are a breeding ground for germs. Due to the risk of spreading germs, in addition to conventional washcloths, disposable washcloths are used in the care sector, which are disposed of after use. Quote end. One thing the name makes clear in its austere objectivity: where washcloths are mentioned, it is neither about cosmetic luxury nor about the desire for fragrance and smoothness, but about personal hygiene as a mode and testimony of self-hardening. It is no coincidence that the washcloth is discussed in the context of caring for the elderly and the sick. Those who are lucky enough to be healthy enough to not have to rely on doctors, nurses, or caregivers to help them with their daily lives use washcloths at most to clean tiles or as a supplementary means to the end of personal hygiene. For the purpose of body care, which encompasses more than hygiene, differentiated and more pleasant techniques of self-treatment have emerged in the course of the process of civilization: the use of lotions, creams, pads, and tinctures. While these are responsible for the nuances, the washcloth takes care of the rough stuff. In the form of the wash mitt, it recalls the outdated practice of DIY car washing and reduces the body that is washed with it to a bodily appliance that its owner has to maintain with the same reliability as other household items. It is important to note that here too it is a matter of maintenance, not care or even love. Cotton-containing terry cloth combines efficiency and brutality and meets the taste of those who regularly want to clean up, but don't want to spend too much time and patience on it. The washcloth belongs more to the product segment of care items than to the world of public bathing facilities and communal showers in boarding schools and nursing homes, much like curd soap. It is reminiscent of austere, precarious, prescribed collectivity, of the constraints of necessity and of the violence that individuals must inflict on themselves in order to prove their belonging to the group. That is why the ideal washcloth is as interchangeable as the person who uses it, and should be replaced in the same way as the person after proper use. Every good washcloth is a disposable washcloth, otherwise there is a risk of germ transmission. This is the relationship of the washcloth to the condom, which, regardless of its practical value, is in any case an emblem of postmodern politics of prevention, precaution, and avoidance. It must be put on before any bodily contact, but afterwards it belongs in the trash, because as a hygiene product without any aesthetic surplus value, it is reminiscent of the filth that it helps to scrub away. In this ambiguity, the washcloth is a German object. It embodies a hygiene that, because it aims for nothing but cleanliness, reproduces dirt, infection, and the spread of germs. Because it wants nothing but cleanliness, it repeatedly threatens to become a breeding ground for the organic, for the teeming life. For Kretschmann's Germans, the washcloth is something similar to organic waste. Everyone should have it in the house, but because it constantly threatens to smell musty, it must be supervised, renewed, and recomposted, just as decent citizens do with their life story. So it is not paradoxical, but rather consequent, that the same people who until recently regarded anyone who did not disinfect their hands 10 times a day as a state delegitimizer now believe they can recognize the good citizen by the use of rags and the avoidance of baths. Those who want total hygiene do not find musty fellow citizens offensive. Those who beat every critical remnant out of their bodies with a cloth every morning can do without powder and mascara. Those who have conviction do not need beauty, and those who renounce themselves need not fear the future. Only those for whom life is more than a clinic will shed a few tears in the green future. But even those can be wiped away, if necessary, with a washcloth. With chaos on earth, you achieve great order in the country. This maxim of Mao Zedong, which became decisive in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, seems to be remembered by some Green politicians at present. Since its foundation in 1980, the Green Party was not only characterized by left-wing alternative offshoots of the folkish nature conservation movement, but also by Maoists who found no place either in the academically dominated New Left or in small socialist parties. In West German K-groups, they had learned revolutionary obedience and contempt for any kind of petty bourgeois attitude. On the other hand, they abhorred the bureaucratic sluggishness and reliance on parties as institutions of social change that were found among orthodox socialists and in the DKP. In contrast to this, the K-groups combined loyalty to the party line and ascetic morals with contemporary skills such as a talent for improvisation, group-compliant initiative, and a penchant for spontaneous destruction. Gunter Maschke, once an SDS member and later a leading figure of the New Right, described the alliance of loyalty to the party line and individualism in his 1973 study Kritik de Guerrillero. On the theory of people's war, the best known among the former Green Maoists today is probably Baden-Württemberg's Prime Minister Winfried Kretschmann, who, through his authoritarian coronavirus policy, with which he has even surpassed Bavarian Prime Minister Markus Söder, has demonstrated over the past 2 years that he has mastered the socio-psychological re-education of the population. But Reinhard Bütikofer, chairman of the European Green Party, who took China's side in the Taiwan conflict and at the same time called on the European Union to engage in a system competition with the People's Republic, and Ralph Fuchs, who with his current wife Marie-Eloise Beck, founded the Liberal Modern Center, which advocates for the West in the war against Ukraine, were also Maoists in their early days. An examination of the forms that the Maoist influence took on Green politicians in their later fields of activity could possibly show that, despite the contrary nature of their later orientation, one motif has been retained: the conviction that political goals cannot be achieved by the means of traditional party politics, but rather through a cultural and moral political transformation of the population. While the responsive among the ex-Maoist cadre groups later became, in the best case, state-skeptical liberals, the tendency towards authoritarian moralizing dominates the green energy policy of the present. In this, Mao's speech of establishing order through chaos comes to itself in a certain sense belatedly. The maxim was aimed at the idea that you first have to take away everything that people take for granted, that the conveniences, cherished habits, and harmless everyday things that are the prerequisite for a pleasant life must be destroyed so that the need for an order that takes responsibility for their lives away from them can grow in the unsettled individual. Today, the field of activity of such authoritarian morality is no longer limited to education and culture, but also includes infrastructure and consumer protection policy. The agency for its enforcement is the Federal Network Agency for Electricity, Gas, Telecommunications, Post and Railway, which was founded in 1998 as the Regulatory Authority for Telecommunications and Post, and has been headed by former Green Party politician Klaus Muller since March 2022. He was born in 1970, which is why he is clearly too young for a Maoist background. It is all the more surprising how much he can hold a candle to his elders in authoritarian moralizing. Muller heads a federal agency that emerged from the state-initiated breakup and privatization of former state-owned enterprises, the remnants of which are now to be taken back into state control by means of competition control, centralization, and networking. However, this is not for the purpose of securing a basic infrastructure service for all citizens, but with the aim of morally regulating their everyday behavior. The Federal Network Agency, which emerged from the Federal Ministry of Telecommunications, is an agency of the Federal Ministry of Economics and Climate Protection. Since 2005, it has been responsible for the regulation of the electricity and gas supply, and since 2006 for the rail infrastructure. In this respect, its creation is part of the post-reunification history, in the wake of which state-operated transport and supply infrastructures were privatized or partially privatized. Deutsche Bahn AG was formed in 1994 by the merger of Deutsche Bundesbahn and Deutsche Reichsbahn into a holding company that is wholly owned by the federal government. In 1995, the privatization of the public company Deutsche Bundespost led to the creation of Deutsche Telekom, which has since been joined by other telecommunications providers. The privatization of Deutsche Post took place in 1999 without its monopoly really being broken up. The gas and electricity market is more liberalized compared to postal traffic. Although the Federal Network Agency reports to the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Protection, it combines competencies that were formerly distributed among the Ministries of Economics, Transport, and, to some extent, Justice, Antitrust, and Competition Law. By ensuring competitive and technical control of the transport, communication, and energy supply networks and guaranteeing non-discriminatory access to them, it combines elements of market liberalism with traditional state responsibilities in the area of infrastructure policy. In reality, it thereby perpetuates the contradiction between economic liberalism and state interventionism that is characteristic of Germany. On the one hand, by forcing the former monopolists to open up the markets to competitors, it promotes the deregulation of former areas of state economic control. On the other hand, by guaranteeing the continued existence of state regulatory authority over the material infrastructure, which private individuals must also use, it ensures, in accordance with the doctrine of the dialectic of chaos and order, that nominally free competition continues to be subject to state control. The disastrous state of the Deutsche Bahn, the almost non-existent customer orientation of the postal service, and Germany's backwardness in terms of digitization are all consequences of the fact that since the pseudo-liberalization of telecommunications, transport, and energy supply, the spheres of competence of the market and the state have become hopelessly intertwined instead of being disentangled. There is neither a transparent state regulatory policy nor a truly free market in which the best for the vast majority could prevail according to its own logic. Rather, elements of state control, which are confused with social policy, and elements of state neglect, which are confused with liberalism, coexist. In Germany, the contradictions between market and state have always been cemented by morality, which is not seen as the result of the free negotiation of conflicting interests, but is imposed by the civil state. It is probably due to this degradation of morality to a community-founding ideological cement that Klaus Muller has acted almost exclusively as the nation's senior teacher since taking office. He does not comment on the energy crisis, which was forced upon us by wrong decisions, from the perspective of someone who has to mediate between economic constraints and the documented demands of citizens, but as the mouthpiece of gas storage tanks, heating systems, and showerheads. The way he spoke a year ago was like the virus spoke through Marcus Soder, who knew from the gut what Corona allows or forbids us. From the point of view of storage levels, I have to say clearly that everyone is called upon to save gas today. Similar to Karl Lauterbach in the field of health policy, Muller relies on experts in the field of supply policy instead of his official duty to legitimize his unsolicited moral lectures: 1 degree less temperature in the apartment, 2 minutes less in the shower, and a critical look at the heating pump at the end of the heating season, and I'm already quite close to the 10% target. He quoted consumer advocate and energy expert Martin Brandis on Twitter. And in an interview with the TAS newspaper, which covers the constitutive contradiction between economic and climate policy no less efficiently than the name of Robert Habeck's ministry does, Muller said, without blushing, "I believe that the price, with its anti-social harshness, will be the most effective measure to ensure that private households also save gas." End quote. The commitment to an anti-social policy as a means of controlling the population through energy policy can hardly be understood in any other way than that, in addition to the upper-class freeloaders, heated baths and pools, attacked by Habeck, lower-class freeloaders are now also to be presented as irresponsible. The Brandis quote cited by Mueller is interesting for another reason. It signals a profound change in the meaning of the term consumer protection. Traditionally, consumer protection, which in Austria, unlike in Germany, is still sympathetically referred to as consumer protection, was originally intended to protect consumers from undue manipulation, to enable them to make free purchasing decisions in the limited area of market participation, and thus, conversely, to ensure that suppliers were not influenced by state intervention, the formation of monopolies or oligopolies, and were able to compete as freely as possible. The federal government, on the other hand, seems to understand consumer protection as protection of consumers from themselves. The only legitimate consumer is the sustainable, climate-friendly, health-conscious citizen who, every time they turn on the tap, keeps an eye on their ecological footprint as well as world politics. Consumer protection in this sense is moral consumer control and self-protection of the state against the perception of state misconduct. The population will have to adjust to the fact that the metaphor of the network, which Mueller's agency bears in its name, is also being understood by the federal government in terms of realpolitik in the sense of an authoritarian moral concept. Not, as has been the case for a long time, as an image for the free movement of goods, opinions and self-interests, which the more space the state allows them, intertwine all the more effectively, but as a model of a community of voluntary renunciants who expect less and less from their own lives the less they grant each other. The idea of dismantling social infrastructure and returning to archaic provisional roots is so bleak that hopefully many of those who rhetorically conjure it up do not live by it in their everyday lives. Then the sustainable green cultural revolution could very quickly prove to be a postmodern castle in the air. Recently, Federal Transport Minister Volker Wissing, FDP, apparently made his first personal inspection of the rail since taking office. He summarized his impressions of the state of the Deutsche Bahn in an interview with ZDF Hoot in the words, "What I found in terms of infrastructure is unsatisfactory in every respect. The rail network is in need of a general overhaul, and this general overhaul is a matter for the boss. Parts of the rail network that are heavily used should be expanded into a high-performance network. Construction measures should be coordinated centrally and customer friendliness should be improved. I expect that in the future we will be able to set the clock by the railway again," Wissing said, in a symptomatic lack of logic. Shouldn't the railway have to keep to the clock rather than the clock to the railway? The twisted formulation, in which the railway determines what time it is instead of simply following its own timetable, expresses the ambiguity of the newly discovered customer and citizen orientation in German infrastructure policy. The revival of public and civic spirit in transport policy after 2 years of almost complete paralysis of the public sphere in the name of total virus protection was triggered by the introduction at the beginning of June of a €9 ticket for local public transport and regional railways. The fact that this summer gift to the public is not an expression of a well-thought-out combination of social and transport policy, but of pure populism, is something that the punks who use it to finally get to SYLT cheaply probably know better than other rail customers. Since the beginning of the coronavirus crisis, the use of local and long-distance transport, which should actually be available to anyone who pays for it without restriction, has been tied to irregular regulations based not on empirical findings but on hypothetical model calculations, some of which, such as the mask requirement, still persist, while others, such as the testing requirement, may be reintroduced in the fall. These regulations, which have increasingly become an end in themselves as the epidemiological situation has eased, have been superimposed as a second infrastructure, imposed by statistical modelers and virologists on the citizens, over the transport infrastructure. The loss of passengers, the loss of personnel and the dismantling of the already dilapidated technical and structural facilities have since left long-distance and local transport largely idle. This desolation was followed by the consumer political shock of the €9 ticket, which, contrary to all reason, makes what was once taken for granted in times of bourgeois normality, increased excursion and travel traffic in summer, higher capacity utilization with low-cost offers, appear as an infrastructure political disaster. By turning the normal bourgeois situation into an emergency by deconstructing civility and sociality, the legal state of emergency, which continues to exist in legal terms, is extended in people's everyday perception. Normality is experienced as an excessive demand, and a return to a reasonably predictable daily routine is experienced as an imposition, while the real imposition, the extension of the state of emergency ad infinitum, appears, in the chaos of everyday life, as the better alternative, to which we should definitely return in October. The same reversal of normality and chaos has been evident since the start of the summer vacation season from the lack of staff at airports, but also in cafes, restaurants and pubs. Just because air travel has been almost completely shut down during the corona crisis by emergency regulations, the gradual return of demand appears as a personnel and infrastructure catastrophe. And because the catering industry has lost its appeal due to the regulation of testing and vaccination requirements, along with the control obligations imposed on staff, who often work under miserable conditions anyway, many cafes in city centers are closing as early as 6 p.m. on Sundays. The transformation of the service sector into a kind of global delivery service is doing away with all the communicative skills traditionally associated with service occupations. The signs in many shops saying "please keep contact short" are, for example, anti-service advertising, and makes any approach to reviving public life, which necessarily includes public consumption, appear as an excessive demand on society. The rundown infrastructure in local, long-distance and travel traffic, in gastronomy and entertainment has been overlaid by the corona test infrastructure for 2 years. The fact that people will have to pay for the use of this infrastructure, which is being imposed on citizens by the state, according to the will of Health Minister Karl Lauterbach, from July onwards, gives the reversal of chaos and order an absurd twist. The cost of corona tests is not only a further step towards implementing a compulsory vaccination policy enforced in the guise of voluntarism. It is also a further step towards the self-destruction of the bourgeois economy and the instrumental reason on which it is based. The test centers are significant in terms of labor market policy, not as part of a solidary healthcare system, but as part of a population policy control system, in which people are encouraged to participate not by cost-benefit calculations, but by internalized coercion. The most important purpose they serve is to conceal real unemployment, and the fraud that takes place in this area is a consequent result of this concealment. Where service occupations, be it in the travel industry, gastronomy or small trade, are systematically made unprofitable by the ongoing emergency measures, the infrastructure of test centers creates a new demand induced by state compulsion rather than by individual needs, and thus new, albeit precarious jobs for in many cases useless and unwanted services. If the unemployment hidden by this is not to become visible, mass testing must be maintained even if it has lost all health policy function. This, not concern for public health, is the driving force behind current corona policy. The more resources are allocated to the expansion of this illusory and self-serving infrastructure, the more the civil infrastructure, which is a means to other ends and must prove itself economically, will be eroded. The post-pandemic model state would, if thought through to its logical conclusion, be an unstate, a polity that does not invest its public funds in its own maintenance and improvement, but in its own abolition in favor of a higher purpose that is no longer accessible to rationality. Friedrichstrasse was once Berlin's most famous boulevard. Then the cars were banned. Now even the bicycles are to disappear. When the record Marlene Singt Berlin, Berlin was released in 1965, which Marlene Dietrich considered her best album, the world that was evoked in the songs she sang was already in the past. It was not nostalgia that was expressed in the recordings, but an aggressive recollection. The urbanity captured in the old Berlin songs had been destroyed by the inhabitants of the country that Dietrich left for the United States in the early 1930s. By remembering the Berlin of the Weimar Republic, Marlene Dietrich held up to the present what no longer existed in it. A leitmotif of the songs was the big city boulevard. The song Unturn Linden, written by Willie Collo, begins with the lines, "I like to promenade under the lime trees / I always like to pass by / oh, when the passage is difficult / and the pushing and shoving / for a kilometer / you see nothing but crowd / and in the midst of it all / the police ride / proudly." The song is about the dangers and delights of human traffic. The average city dweller can only promenade like the rich and beautiful because the boulevard is a stage that brings together different forms of traffic and allows everyone to see and be seen. Crowds are not a nuisance, but the law of motion of this everyday life, which is as fleeting as it is differentiated, and to which the guardians of order who watch over it also feel they belong. The song also describes a somewhat seedy form of intercourse, the ladies who pass by, and with whom the passerby can tie up in order to lead them from Café Bauer to Pariserplatz, from the jewelry store to the Schultheiss pub, are not prostitutes, but also not respectable citizens shopping at the department store. Because they have no fixed destination, they are open to seduction. Because they are looking for distraction, they allow themselves to be led astray. The prerequisite for the possibility of getting involved with strangers passing by is the big city traffic, which converges in the boulevard: pedestrians, cafe visitors, employees, loiterers, scroungers, cops, young and old, passers-by, cars, buses and carriages form a difficult, fleeting, all-encompassing network. If there are any trace elements of such everyday experiences in today's Berlin, they are likely to be permanently eradicated by the traffic calming, asphalt planting and people straightening policies of the Green Party Senator for Mobility, Bettina Jarasch. In the summer of 2020, Jarasch's party colleague and predecessor in office, Regine Gunther, came up with the idea of transforming Berlin's Friedrichstrasse, which, together with Unter den Linden, forms an ensemble of boulevards in the old center of Berlin, into a sustainable, climate-friendly, decelerated, i.e., anti-metropolitan and anti-citizen boulevard. Between Französische and Leipziger Strasse, Friedrichstrasse was calmed, which means nothing other than the paralysis of urban traffic. By transforming the boulevard into a pedestrian zone characteristic of provincial towns and decorating the cleared asphalt with green plants and water elements, the avant-garde among Western metropolises was imagined. In the course of the experiment, almost all of the department stores, luxury stores and retail outlets disappeared from Friedrichstrasse. Employees of nearby offices and the Humboldt University no longer spend their lunch breaks there because, apart from Starbucks donuts and Fairtrade coffee, there is nothing on offer. Even for a stroll, hardly anyone visits the promenade zone, as it is called by the Senate, because it is more appealing to look out the window at home. Instead of dealing with the urban planning disasters of her predecessor, Bettina Jarasch can think of nothing better than to redirect cyclists who were previously allowed on the traffic-calmed part of Friedrichstrasse to the parallel Charlottenstrasse, which is also to be cleared of cars and rededicated as a bicycle street. In the future, pedestrians will be able to get bored in Friedrichstrasse, while in Charlottenstrasse they could be knocked over by helmeted racing cyclists. If Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, makes good on her promise to turn the center of Paris into a comprehensive pedestrian zone in 2022, the next Western European metropolis will be at risk of losing the urbanity that defines it. Images of car-free Sundays, with which the Champs-Élysées is regularly blessed, offer a glimpse of the future. Scattered pedestrians trot along the boulevard, built for a friendly harmony of pedestrians, cars and buses, as if through an oversized open-air sanatorium. If this is the urban planning of the future, those who felt comfortable in the corona lockdown would indeed not have to change their lifestyle. Since the beginning of the year, a new everyday spectacle has been observed at the tram stops of the Leipziger Verkehrsbetrieb, LVB. As long as potential passengers are not visible to the driver at the station or those getting off press the stop button, the tram races past the station. Those left behind then regularly step out of the waiting shelter to watch the train that they missed despite arriving on time. Some wave unsuccessfully at the driver, others resign themselves to taking a seat again or walking, while passengers who forgot to request a stop have to travel one station too far. If the people gathered at the stop are clever rather than phlegmatic, the arrival of the train takes on a different character. Those who want a ride position themselves at the edge of the platform, arms flailing. The train stops, lets people get on and off, and both driver and passengers are happy to think that they are not just participating in the normal execution of a service, but are making their own contribution to the diversity of city life. On their website, the LVB described the introduction of the on-demand stop, which is otherwise more commonly found in rural areas, as a contribution to the fight against climate change. In the usual mixture of buddy-buddyism and damaged grammar, it says, the on-demand stop, and thus you too, helps us to save energy. On the one hand, the approach process at the stop is no longer necessary and we can avoid unnecessary door opening. Because in winter, this repeatedly lowers the temperature in the vehicle and in summer, we can maintain the low temperature in the vehicle. In addition, there is less wear and tear on the doors because they are opened less. End of quote. It doesn't matter that in recent years, for reasons of infection control, even though COVID-19 is not transmitted by smear infection, all trams automatically opened their doors at all stops so that no one would catch corona by pressing the button. It doesn't matter that the doors of public transport are there to be opened and closed regularly, so their wear and tear must be expected as long as they are not museum pieces. The LVB does not provide any information on how much energy is saved by avoiding unnecessary door opening. Instead, they adopt a tone as if passengers were underprivileged toddlers. Stand in a clearly visible position at the stop to board. Don't hide in or behind the passenger shelter or, if necessary, give the driver a hand signal. If you are traveling with us and want to get off, press the stop request button in good time, which is located at the doors and other places in our vehicles. Because when you press the stop request button, the driver receives a signal and knows that you want to get off. End of quote. Translated into less simple but understandable language, this means, if the tram does not stop at your station, it is your own fault because you are hiding in or behind the passenger shelter. If you want to be taken along, you have to do something about it. It is not enough to buy a ticket, you have to give the driver a signal to confirm your willingness to cooperate. If the tram has already left by the minute it is supposed to arrive, It is not that the driver left too early, but that you arrived too late, because our drivers always try to stick to the timetable. Above all, however, the following applies to the LVB. We don't have to be reliable because we are paid by you, but you have to be well disposed towards us because we are so nice to take you with us. That's why we don't address you like an adult, but we do address you like the idiot we think you are. The audacity with which the LVB wants to foist the self-destruction of public infrastructure on the citizens as energy policy progress is nothing more than moral blackmail. Citizens should therefore react to it as they would to blackmail, either by no longer riding or paying, or if they ride and pay, by repeatedly pressing the stop button at every station. One of the most likable German associations is FUS EV, the Professional Association for the Representation of the Interests of Pedestrians. It advocates for barrier-free and sufficiently wide sidewalks, for useful traffic lights and against those that serve no function, and for a fair coexistence of pedestrians and drivers. It supports pedestrians in taking action against intrusive parking offenders and encroaching cyclists, and maintains contact persons in numerous cities. In Leipzig, it has been cooperating for some time with a local representative for pedestrian traffic. On its website and at events, the association reminds people of the social implications of walking as an urban form of locomotion. It is only half true that walking has become a privilege of the bourgeoisie in general, which was eroded with the absorption of the bourgeoisie into a post-bourgeois society. In any case, the opportunity to move around the city on foot is currently used more often by particularly poor and particularly wealthy people than by genuine citizens, more often by young and old than by those who are economically and politically in the prime of their lives. The 2018 study Mobility in Germany, conducted by the Infos Institute on behalf of the Federal Ministry of Transport, shows that the ways in which people move around in public spaces are once again becoming more differentiated according to economic differences. 20 to 30% of people with low or very low incomes stated in the survey that they had chosen to walk on the respective day of the survey, as did 15 to 20% of people with very high incomes. By contrast, the upper middle class are the most likely to choose not to walk if another means of transportation is available. Furthermore, people of all social status are most likely to walk in the periods before entering the labor force and after retiring. The significance of walking as the posture of the self-assured citizen, who is in any case a highly ideological figure in the face of the mute compulsion of the capitalist totality, only survived as a form of decay in the phrase of the upright walk. Meanwhile, it seems to have fallen further in price. If at all, walking functions as a negative privilege, as a means of transportation for those who have no other choice or who can take it because they are exempt from the constraints of self-preservation. At the same time, those who walk a lot are often particularly vulnerable road users. Children and the elderly are not only among the most unpredictable factors in road traffic, but are also its most easy victims. The demonetization of the automobile, which has been the target of campaigns similar to those against smoking in recent years, has not yet had a profound impact on the mobility habits of the population. The share of cars in traffic volume continues to increase, albeit less sharply than in previous years. Meanwhile, cars are being used more often by older people and seniors and less often by the younger generation, whose members are more likely to do without a car if they have a secure social status. The fact that this group is also the least willing to walk confirms the everyday impression that the crowds of cyclists that make cycling in the city so unpleasant are largely recruited from their ranks. If the proportion of pedestrians in traffic is at a record low of just over 20% today, despite attempts to contain car traffic in cities, it may have something to do with the fact that road users equipped with bicycles and other rolling vehicles are just as aggressive in claiming the space taken up by cars in cities as Sunday drivers used to be. The anti-ageist campaigns of recent years, disguised as contributions to housing policy, must be seen in this context. The eviction of a retirement home run by the Protestant Church in Berlin, of which the residents were informed at the end of 2022 that they had to move to other accommodations within a year, did not become the starting point of a debate on migration policy, but on generational policy. The building was to be converted into a refugee shelter, which receives more state funding than the operation of a nursing home. However, because questioning such policies could have fueled resentment against migrants, the measure was discussed in terms of the housing needs of prospective new citizens, rather than addressing its hostility towards the elderly. The debate on whether old people in Germany have too much living space in relation to the rent is along the same lines. Instead of promoting the unbureaucratic construction of new apartments, researchers and politicians are thinking about how to make it attractive for the elderly to move into smaller, less attractive apartments in unfamiliar surroundings. The Social Democrat Bernhard Daldrup and the Green Party politician Christina Johan Schroeder are selling the idea of encouraging old people who live in a home that is too large for their needs to move to smaller apartments, the rent for which they could then deduct from their taxes. Stefan Sebastian, an economist at the University of Regensburg, is considering whether older people who live in apartments that are too large for their needs at a favorable rent can be encouraged to move to smaller apartments by rent increases. Apart from the fact that the concept of housing needs, on which such considerations are based, is abstractly statistical and follows a notion of distributive justice that disregards quality of life and individual experience, it is insinuated that not only the old take away living space from the young, but also the long-established take away living space from newcomers. Instead of making the relative comfort in which at least many old people can still live under the current conditions of tenancy law on their pensions and savings the benchmark for housing policy planning, all those who still benefit from the former better conditions are still profiting from the former better conditions are regarded as inflexible custodians of vested rights and narrow-minded creatures of habit, who are to be brought to their senses, not by immediate coercion, but by nudging, by economic moral blackmail. Such caring intrusiveness towards unruly old people is nothing new. Rather, the considerations of evicting old people from their homes are in line with the defamation of senior citizens driving cars as climate pigs, the scandalization of the particular danger that pensioners allegedly pose to road traffic, as well as with the forced confinement of old people in apartments and homes during the corona pandemic, which came under the guise of care. If the contradiction between the slogan that the aim is to protect the elderly and vulnerable and the practice of preventing the spread of the disease, which prohibited residents of retirement homes from going out, praised it as charity, to avoid physical contact, and forbade relatives from participating in the last days of their grandmothers and grandfathers, is hardly noticed to this day. This is due to a form of memory loss that goes hand in hand with a practiced lack of conscience. Even contemporaries who are critical of the measures taken are often unable to say what they actually did, thought, and felt in the years between 2020 and 2023, and how their lives changed during that time. "I've already checked off the next year for myself," was a common piece of information from people during the corona period, who thus revealed that they would resign themselves to the inevitable with frustration but without resistance. The independently practiced loss of memory, a self-abandonment of the genuinely human ability to synthesize the past of one's life history with the present, has become second nature to members of the woke generation. Perhaps, as with any mass sect, it is precisely in this self-amnesia and self-apathy that the awakening of the awakened takes place. To feel reborn, one must get rid of everything that weighs on one as an irrevocably born person, inhibits one, but also shapes one, distinguishes one and binds one to the only life one has in sorrow and love. People you knew, places where you lived and where you left your own indelible mark just as you were shaped by them. Memories that bind you to the past even when you leave it behind. The truth content of family memory consists, despite all the falsification it does to the past, in the moment of effectivity, the individual charging of what has become historical with fantasies attached to it, without which there would be no memory just as there would be none without the facts that ignite the fantasies. Not out of socio-political necessity, but because intergenerational justice for the representatives of the woke generation means the ruthless clearing away of everything that still reminds us of such an interweaving of objectivity and subjective experience, the old are to be transplanted from their ancestral homes into climate-gender and generation-neutral vegetation communities. Apartments, no different than cars and any other property beyond its immediate usefulness, are crystallizations of past and present experience, sedimented individual life. For this very reason, expropriation in all totalitarian states has always been an act of dispossession that detaches people from their own history, from their past, present, and future. In Nazi Germany, the expulsion, persecution, and murder of Jews went hand in hand with the state-sponsored and covered robbery of their property and its communitization in the worst sense. In any case, and this should be remembered in view of the self-elevation of the woke generation to the avant-garde against the right, National Socialism did not begin with the expulsion of foreigners, but with the stigmatization and persecution of one's own, familiar and German Jews, a barbarism that was not carried out by ossified old people, but by the youth, whose preferred party was the NSDAP. The Nazis only became old in the retrospective view of the children and grandchildren. In the present at the time, they were mostly as young as those today who have lost the memory of generational history. "The new era is moving with us," was the maxim based on a verse by Hermann Claudius, which was taken up by the labor movement in the Weimar Republic. In the early days of National Socialism, it was embraced equally by Jungbundisch, life reformers, environmentalists and Nazi scouts, and in the GDR it found its way into the hymnbooks of the FDJ. The young always professed it, not in order to blindly obey the old, but to put an end to their rule. Those who rise up against the right today know, remember and suspect nothing of all this. Their grandparents and great-grandparents, who have been forced into retirement, could explain it to them. Traffic lights for nutrition, corona, and climate. A traffic light system for regulating road traffic has become the guiding principle of German government policy. The colors of the current coalition are no coincidence. Green triggers a reflex that overrides all rational thought. In the film Portrait of an Enlightened Man, produced by Helmuth Karasek and Kurt Zimmermann for Hessische Rundfunk in 1969, which shows Max Horkheimer in his then living and working environment in Montagnola, Switzerland, and in Frankfurt am Main, the co-founder of critical theory notes a growing tendency for people to reduce language to signals. In this context, he predicts, people will learn to react essentially to signs in their lives. As a symbol, I simply use the transition across the street to remind us. In the past, you would walk across the street and look right and left, wondering whether you could still cross, and then make the decision. Today you wait for the green light, and when the red light comes, you stop. As a result of this adaptation process, according to Horkheimer, individuals delegate the previously arbitrary judgment of whether it is safe to cross the street to the traffic lights of the road traffic system. This useful habit, based on efficiency and functionality, threatens to become second nature and merge into the substance of the human being. Irrational behavior thus coagulates into a socially mediated instinct that brings people closer to the animal way of reacting. A means to an end, the ordering of everyday bourgeois life, itself becomes an end whose meaning is no longer questioned by those who react to the signal system. 7 years before Horkheimer's diagnosis, his friend and colleague Theodor W. Adorno had already dealt with the abysses of the German road traffic regulations. After his secretary was hit and injured at Senckenbergenlage in Frankfurt, near the Institute for Social Research, Adorno called for the installation of traffic lights in the entire university area in a letter to the editor of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. He explained his reasoning as follows. On the way to the university, people have to run across the street in an undignified manner, as if they were running for their lives. Should a student or a professor now find themselves in the state that is actually appropriate for them, namely in thought, the immediate consequence is the threat of death. Of course, someone who is lost in thought is just as likely to miss a red light as a vehicle turning the corner. Nevertheless, Adorno's report complements Horkheimer's remarks. Where the lack of a traffic light forces people to cross the street as if they were running for their lives, this is just as unworthy of them, just as close to the animalistic way of reacting as the behavior of people who, like a trained herd of animals at a red light, stop even when no cars are coming far and wide. In both cases, reflection is abandoned and replaced by reflex, the mere reaction to external stimuli. Today, Horkheimer and Adorno's preoccupation with the connection between the traffic system and social psychology seems outdated. Traffic lights seem almost cumbersome in the midst of the signals of contemporary communication systems. Yet the reduction of social forms of intercourse to stimulus-response connections, as demonstrated by Horkheimer using the example of traffic lights, has been implemented in everyday life to an extent the critical theorists could never have imagined. With the digitalization of not only work but also leisure communication, which levels the boundary between the two spheres, social intercourse is transforming into a standardized setting of icons, abbreviations, signal tones and colors, to which people unconsciously and yet voluntarily react like the proverbial Pavlovian dog. Every bling that WhatsApp emits when a text message has been received is followed by a message check with such inveterate matter-of-factness that users have to mute their cell phones to avoid being on constant alert. The decision, which Horkheimer also identifies as the reflexive basis of habitual everyday actions, is taken away from users by the digitally mediated convergence of impulse and feedback. The prompt succession of stimulus and reaction is hardly ever interrupted by hesitation, so that the constant sense of being driven and on call that characterizes the communication monads can hardly be distinguished from a hustle and bustle of the pedestrian in the anarchic traffic described by Adorno. The means of communication, which are supposed to make people less dependent on the contingencies of everyday life, in fact keep people dependent. It is only on this material and psychodynamic basis that we can understand why, over the past 2 years, traffic lights have been able to advance almost without resistance from a means of regulating road traffic to a principle of organization and discipline in almost all areas of bourgeois life, which is precisely why it is less and less of one. During these 2 years, the corona traffic lights presented daily in the media did not simply serve to inform citizens about current incidences and the associated risks of infection, but functioned as unquestionable appeals for behavior and orders to act. Even the incidences themselves, the numbers, as they were only referred to, never had the significance of data material that, like all statistical data, would have had to be interpreted, but appeared exclusively as sanction-reinforced behavioral commands in a general discourse on health policy that was merged with domestic, economic, and security policy. Even the instrumentalization of private health data, such as information about vaccination status, as a means of social exclusion through seemingly abstract combinations of characters, 3G, 2G, 2G+, was smoothly implemented within a few weeks. The fact that the supposedly objective because fact-based signals and codes, which henceforth regulated access to the civil public sphere instead of the principles of citizenship and law abidance, reflected imperatives of discrimination and social selection, that they were anything but value-neutral indices remained unquestioned for 2 years, as did the rhetoric of scientific neutrality, which presented data in need of interpretation as a conglomerate of pure facts in order to justify measures. When, at the height of the 2G and 3G regulations, people in some city centers, such as Leipzig, were allowed to prove their status by wearing colored bands on their wrists to save time, the similarity to the labeling of farm animals was not even noticed by anyone. What worked for Corona can also be applied to the field of climate and energy policy with modified parameters. Individual federal states such as the dark green Baden-Württemberg have already introduced a climate traffic light as an index of sustainable management in various spheres of production, such as in the skilled trades and also in the education sector. And the shirt-sleeved manner in which economics and climate minister Robert Habeck, the supposedly resulting follow-up costs of Germany's engagement against Russia, in reality as a receipt for a self-destructive energy policy, rising gas and electricity prices increases in advance to the private households of German citizens, who are rewarded for their patience with minimal price reductions, shows that sociality and political public life could be replaced by the principle of traffic light switching in the long term as well. The introduction of a citizen's income, which has been put on hold for the time being, the gifts distributed by the state to support public transport, the advertising for unpaid social engagement and other forms of community service based on loyalty rather than market mediation, fit in with this. Enthusiasm for nudging, empowerment, and for bogus self-employment disguised as a startup culture psychotechnically accompanies the transformation of society into a behavioristically controlled social transport system. The fact that the coalition of Social Democrats, Greens and Liberals is now referred to as the traffic light, not only in media jargon but also in self-representation, seems more than just a coincidence in this context. Rather, the traffic light is organizing the self-transformation of the bourgeois public sphere into a digitally controlled, systemically sealed network of autonomous automata Jean Baudrillard, for which personal responsibility, civil liberties and democratic participation are not something that individuals, in coordinated contradiction to one another and to the impositions of the state, have to wrest from the state and themselves. Rather, they are effects of the optimal use of the infrastructure provided to them by the state and the rest of society. It is not surprising that such pseudo-individualism is most purely embodied within the coalition by the Greens, whose color politically outshines the other traffic light colors. Contrary to a popular criticism of the party, the Greens have long since ceased to stand for a return of bourgeois society to autochthonous communities, for the idolization of origin and creatureness and the playing off of nature conservation against urbanity. On the contrary, they combine regressive fantasies with an optimism about technology and progress, most clearly under the buzzword of climate protection. Today's Greens are no longer a party of dungarees and watering flowers, but an association of digitally savvy ecological system protectors, which, when it comes to glorifying technological progress, is on a par with the FDP, from which they differ in their political objectives. The terms climate and ecosystem, which have replaced nature and environment since the 1980s, come from cybernetics and follow the logic of the network, which replaces the concept of social organization. Both reactionary and modern, the Greens of the 21st century most radically represent the self-destruction of bourgeois society, which is summed up in the image of the traffic light. In his eponymous 1967 magnum opus, Guy Debord, the founder of situationism, attempts to conceptualize the state of capitalist socialization, which had become globally hegemonic by the end of the Second World War at the latest, as a society of the spectacle, drawing on Marx's critique of fetish. The spectacle is capital that has reached such a degree of accumulation that it becomes an image, is his central finding. What is meant is that the generalized production of commodities usurps all of concrete life and all of the experiences made in it, and allows them to become commodities themselves, successively transforming people into purely passive spectators of the world of commodity aesthetic images that they actually produce themselves. The social relationship between people appears to them only as a social relationship mediated by images, whereby the alienating character of human beings to each other and to the world around them, already diagnosed by Marx, threatens to become total. Anyone who has ever consciously observed the media consumption of their contemporaries, and perhaps their own, from a critical distance, especially since the advent of smartphones, will hardly be able to avoid recognizing Debord's central finding as having been realized in the smallest impulses of everyday life. The spectacle is a life that has become a reel on platforms like Instagram or TikTok. People's communication has given way to a generalized digital flood of images. To use a central concept of the situationist aesthetic, large parts of social life now only take place at the level of a real staging. Now, however, looking at German politics in recent years, it appears that although this takes place through them and their actions, at the same time, the historical process that is unconsciously and blindly taking place behind people's backs not only encompasses their economic, social and cultural life, but that it has also occupied the political sphere, which has so far been characterized more by instrumental reason, Max Horkheimer, and has likewise transformed it into a spectacle. That the immanent logic of the economic process thus encompasses more than just the tendency towards absolute administration, where everyone knows exactly what to do in every situation, much as an employee today knows when faced with certain questions in a company, or like someone walking across the street, no longer just reacts to the signs set by the administration. But the signs and images themselves take on a reality constituting character, in such a way that, in the form of an ideologically overformed staging of the real and the political, only taking up set pieces of reality, it transforms these into spectacular images produced by the political and the media, which, as it were, create a pseudo-reality that was not coincidentally euphemistically called the new normal, in the affirmative terminology of the Corona years, and is increasingly becoming the basis for consequential state action. Here, connections can also be seen to the theory of the French philosopher and media theorist Jean Baudrillard, which he, influenced by the situationists around Debord, whose theoretical assumptions he partially further developed, had already developed at the end of the 70s of the last century with a view to the growing importance of mass media in his main work The Symbolic Exchange and Death. Baudrillard saw the mass media-mediated spread of the flood of commodity aesthetic images to the entire sphere of communication, which he did not want to be understood merely as manipulation, as heralding a social condition in which images, or rather signs, could hardly be distinguished from reality. In place of reality, an artificially simulated hyperreality would arise, which would be without reference and serve only to maintain the entire system by substituting the shrinking profitability of the production of use values by means of an ideal symbolic simulation of exchange values. As clear and insightful as many of Baudrillard's basic theoretical assumptions appear from today's perspective of the Internet age, his media theoretical justifications appear all the more false, at least with regard to the current real-life stagings of the political justifications, seeing as he did the development towards the simulation of hyperreality precisely grounded in the former structure of modern mass media, which degrades people to mere passive consumers of the flood of commodity aesthetic images or symbolic sign codes. Political life, as a vita activa, is a space for creation, for active engagement, and not just for consumption. Its effectiveness is linked to the actors who engage in it, even if it is limited by the prevailing imperatives of the capitalist mode of production, which, as a socially produced relationship, can itself be traced back to human agency. Everything that is pictorial and symbolic, the entire ideological sphere that is conveyed by means of signs, is always both at once, the intellectual result of reality creating action and the processing of an idealized perception of reality that is translated into practice. Consequently, every political enactment of reality also refers to the political reality that is being enacted, and vice versa. And the recent past is full of such enactments of reality, which not only simulate reality but actually constitute a new normal. An event or phenomenon is discursively processed in such a way that it appears to people not only as much larger, but sometimes even as something completely different, as if it had no real connection to reality. As a result of the multiplication of spectacular images, the sheer quantity of the flood of images generated by politics or the media causes people to perceive reality in a qualitatively different way that also changes their perception. With the help of targeted images, e.g. the Bergamo images, panic was stirred up out of what from a medical point of view was merely a respiratory infection, flu, and a pseudo-pandemic was constructed that helped to legitimize the arbitrary but very real temporary exclusion of millions of people from public life. A telegram group of megalomaniacal pension-age citizens, who without having the necessary means to do so, indulge in fantasies of subversion, are being stylized into a serious threat of a coup, the prevention of which is said to have set in motion no fewer than 3,000 police officers. They are accompanied by media representatives who have been informed in advance and who, by means of sensational reporting, present the whole thing in a way that is contrary to all real facts but serves to construct an alternative reality. And a meeting of right-wing populists and conservatives in a remote Potsdam inn, at which a well-known but insignificant Austrian right-wing radical lectures on the possibilities of incentives for remigration and stringent deportation policies, is political media filtering of the ideological state apparatuses, Louis Althusser, is not only taken for more important and made larger than it is, but even with the claim that alleged deportation plans were forged there, placed in a series of traditions with the historic Wannsee Conference. The fact that this was precisely not a meeting of a few scattered opposition members, but one in which the relevant state institutions of Nazi Germany organized the murder of European Jews, is deliberately ignored. Politically correct Holocaust relativization is imagined as a rebellion of the decent, under the label of a fight against the right, but at the same time it is also becoming socially acceptable again. In this respect, the mass ornamentation, Siegfried Kracauer, of the nationwide demonstrations against the right in recent months was not an invention or even a simulated reality by public mass media, not a mere staged play of grotesque street theater, but a collectively staged expression of a typically German construction of reality, which not least also serves to de-thematize the anti-Semitism of Islamic immigrants who have been raging on German streets since October 7th. In contrast to the aforementioned political spectacles of recent years, which are still fresh in the minds of every political observer, an event has probably already faded somewhat in the consciousness of many, although it shows particularly vividly how powerfully the staging of reality can not only shape its perception in the masses, but also simultaneously impact the structure of the state apparatus. We are talking about the events at a demonstration in Chemnitz in 2018, which were reported on by all major media outlets as a hunt after the murder of Daniel H., a German Cuban, by two asylum seekers from Syria and Iraq. The related Maassen case is so interesting because here an alternative reality, created by means of images and spectacularly edited video snippets, in which the circumstances of this murder case no longer played any role at all, not only asserted itself for the purpose of political indoctrination of the population, but was also used as a tool for purging the state's own organs or one of their leading representatives, Hans-Georg Maassen, who was then president of the Domestic Intelligence Service. He had questioned the narrative of hunts and manhunts based solely on the so-called Heysai video, which was eagerly taken up by politicians, and which was based on no further reliable context. As a result, after almost 2 months of actual media persecution, he was placed in temporary retirement by the then Interior Minister, Horst Seehofer. This case study makes it particularly clear that in the much-invoked age of multiple crises, the ruling ideology is finding it increasingly difficult to ensure the necessary unity between the repressive state apparatus and the ideological state apparatuses, because the ideological premises of the ruling class are increasingly coming into conflict with the material and economic reality surrounding it, and that the ideological state apparatuses are less and less able to fulfill the role essentially assigned to them, according to Althusser, namely to ensure the reproduction of the relations of production. For Althusser's theoretical assumptions about the functioning of dominant ideology, as well as its interplay with the state apparatuses that reproduce and mediate it, referred to a time when the current crisis of the representative instances of Republican bourgeois democracy was not yet foreseeable, and they were always partially blind to the essence of the specifically German understanding of democracy that is opposed to this democracy. Since the city of Potsdam last March obtained a nationwide entry ban against Martin Sellner, the former spokesperson of the Identitarian Movement Austria and author of the book Remigration, published by Antaeus Verlag, Sellner's private vacation activities have become a political issue. The reason for this is that the immigration ban, which Sellner is legally challenging, is not being enforced by the immigration authorities as long as Sellner does not use his stay in the Federal Republic for political activity. Jan Thiele, the city of Potsdam's lawyer in the legal dispute with Sellner, told the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung that, in accordance with a request from the Potsdam Administrative Court, the Immigration Office would refrain from enforcing the ban until a legally binding decision was handed down, provided that Sellner did not travel to Germany for the purpose of making high-profile appearances. In a message published on his Telegram channel in mid-April, Sellner himself ruled out visits to Germany for political events for the time being, but he did let his audience vote on whether he should take a pleasure trip to the FRG in the near future, which around 90% of users endorsed. It is not known when and where Sellner intends to take his pleasure trip. His announcement is symptomatic not so much as proof of the truism that right-wingers are the biggest profiteers of the state measures launched against them, but because it testifies to an increasingly drastic, state, and civil society-extorted privatization of politically inopportune opinions and activities. The meeting of right-wingers and right-wing extremists at the Villa Adlon on Lake Lenitz in Potsdam on November 25, 2014, which only became public in mid-January through a report by the research network Corrective that consisted partly of hearsay and speculation, was the result of such forced privatization. Contrary to the report, which was later corrected by corrective, it was not a secret meeting to plan a mass deportation of migrants and Germans with foreign roots in the event of a takeover by right-wing extremists, but an exchange of questionable ideas about more restrictive control, especially of Islamic mass migration. The gathering was private, although it concerned public matters. It could be scandalized as a secret meeting, because it was assumed to have conspiratorial, anti-state intentions. Conversely, however, the private character of the gathering was also the result of the realistic assumption that the same gathering with the participation of a broad public would have been banned as at least state delegitimizing, if not anti-constitutionally preventive. Similarly, the entry ban now compels Sellner to do what he already enjoys doing anyway, namely to declare possible future visits to the Federal Republic of Germany as private pleasure trips and thus to surround his political concerns, which are associated with his visits anyway, with the odor of the clandestine. As a result, he and his clientele objectively behave more and more like the conspirators they are seen as by a government that regards its own personnel not as civil servants, but as the embodiment of the state and considers any harsh criticism of the government to be an expression of hostility towards the state. This confusion has become part of the raison d'etat through the formula of the constitutional protection-relevant delegitimization of the state, which, with reference to the activities of alleged corona deniers during the COVID-19 pandemic, can also be used to observe and, if necessary, sanction political expressions of opinion and activities below the criminal liability threshold. The concept of the delegitimization of the state, which is relevant to the protection of the Constitution, expresses a relationship between the state and its citizens that is as much characterized by panic-stricken powerlessness as it is by presumed omnipotence. It testifies to powerlessness because a bourgeois state that no longer sees the foundations of its constitution threatened solely by demonstrably organized attempts at its removal, but also by expressions of opinion and actions that could undermine confidence in state institutions, must treat its own citizens as potential enemies who need to be carefully supervised and controlled. This understanding of civil liberties as a conditional relaxation of restrictions on freedom goes hand in hand with an assumed omnipotence, because the persecution-hungry view that sees state delegitimizers everywhere where they are in fact government critics can only conceive of civil liberty as the result of total security, that is, as the result of its own self-abolition. But citizens who pursue their own affairs and pursue their own interests instead of always thinking only of the state, who, instead of seeing themselves as 100% citizens in a contradictory double meaning as bourgeois and citoyen, are precisely the best citizens in the sense of a liberal bourgeoisie, because they know how to make use of their freedom instead of seeing it as a mere favor for which they owe lifelong obedience. Anyone who measures civil liberties in terms of their practical value, instead of gratefully accepting them as a gift, is already a potentially subversive element in the eyes of the inventors of the concept of state delegitimization, which is relevant to the protection of the Constitution. The omnipotence that imagines itself powerless, which also increasingly identifies the enemy alien in its own citizens, the enemy in one's own country, is also expressed in the new relationship between the ban on entry and the ban on activity. The fact that Sellner has so far only been denied entry for the purpose of political activity only appears to be a concession to the distinction between public and private. Rather, the occasion for the entry ban itself, the Wannsee Conference 2.0, showed that the logic behind the concept of state delegitimization relevant to the protection of the Constitution blurs the line between private and public, between vacation and business travel. This logic does not follow the form of legal proof of unconstitutional acts, but rather that of rumor, gossip, and guilt by association, according to which Harold Schmidt is now also considered to be on the right because he allowed himself to be photographed at a private meeting with Hans-Georg Maassen and Matthias Matusek, who are also considered to be on the right, without any evidence of subversive activities on their part. Contrary to what many critics of the government who identify as right-wingers believe, the domestic and foreign policy enemy aliens of the traffic light and its civil society organizations are not only actual or alleged right-wingers. The fact that even proven leftists can be targeted by the delegitimization investigators is shown by the case of the former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis. Varoufakis, who today heads the left-wing collective movement Democracy in Europe Movement 2025 DM25, of which he is a co-founder, and was invited as a guest to the Palestine Congresses planned in Berlin and dissolved after it was banned on April 12, was apparently also subject to an entry ban for the period from April 10 to 14. It remains unclear whether the Federal Ministry of the Interior, the City of Berlin, or the immigration authorities were responsible for the ban. A correspondence between Varoufakis' lawyer and the federal police, parts of which were made available by the Frankfurter Rundschau, does not shed any light on the matter either. According to this correspondence, the federal police initially informed Varoufakis that no entry or residence ban within the meaning of Section 11 of the Residence Act had been issued against him, only to write a day later, In the context of a possible participation as a speaker at the Palestine Congress 2024 in Berlin, there was an arrest warrant for your client for a national entry ban, limited to the period of the event from April 10 to 14, 2024. The Ministry of the Interior has so far refrained from commenting, stating that it does not comment on individual cases. It is also unclear what the causal connection was between the entry ban and the Palestine Congresses, which was initially approved under certain conditions and then banned. The immediate reason for the cancellation of the Congress was a speech by the anti-Semitic Palestine activist Salman Abu Sida, who has appeared in public with Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in the past and is banned from political activity in Germany. The ban on the Congress is factually distinct from the travel ban against Varoufakis, because the ban on an event with Hamas sympathizers and Islamist anti-Semites has much more legal validity than the travel and activity ban against a former Greek minister. The fact that Varoufakis, of all people, was made an example of was significant not only because he is familiar with the period of the European Union's and especially Germany's fiscal policy disputes with Greece as the main opponent of the then Christian Democratic Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble. It is also significant because it proves that the solidarity with Israel, which has been elevated to a reason of state since Angela Merkel but is typically more of a symbolic political issue for Germany, is no less indispensable for the self-image of the Federal Republic, which has turned green, as the champion of morality than the commitment to the state-sponsored anti-fascist fight against the far right. It doesn't matter whether Germany continues to support would-be Jewish murderers in the Gaza Strip under the guise of humanitarian aid for the civilian population, even after the anti-Semitic mass pogrom of October 7th, nor does it matter whether the feminist foreign policy expert Baerbock admonishes Israel in the style of a kindergarten teacher, given its military countermeasures, that even legitimate self-defense has its limits. It also doesn't matter that Germany has supported the EU-wide entry restrictions for so-called radical Jewish settlers, which only Viktor Orban did not support, and that these restrictions could potentially also apply to German citizens. A radical left-wing pro-Palestinian Greek anti-imperialist is not allowed into the country, even if he only expresses what Germany itself, with its moralizing equidistance in the Middle East conflict and its support for anti-Israeli cultural figures, is after all a matter close to its heart. In this context, it is interesting that Bernd Rieksinger of the Left Party has linked the entry ban on Varoufakis with a disinvitation of Nancy Fraser, a socialist and Jew, from the Albertus Magnus visiting professorship at the University of Cologne, which she had been promised. The connection is factually and legally fraudulent. Whether a university, with reference to its domestic authority, uninvites an invited social scientist because she has signed an open letter accusing Israel of apartheid policies, or whether a bourgeois state exercises its right to prevent politicians it has identified as subversive from entering the country, are legally and politically different things. Even Nancy Fraser would probably not be identified as an undesirable enemy alien by her harshest opponents. Conversely, however, those who, like the political scientist Klaus Legowi, would have agreed to contradict Fraser on the spot and expose her would probably dare to do the same to Varoufakis without being threatened in body and life by him and his fans. The fact that the Fraser case, which is about the ever-narrowing boundaries of the argumentative dispute at universities, the Varoufakis case, which seems like a late official German government reckoning with a former opponent in European policy, and the Sellner case, in which the left-wing government personnel exposed themselves as a state anti-fascist peace power against the right, despite their differences, all treated under the premise of a moral political defense against internal and external enemies, is typical of the German confusion of politics and morality. It also fits with the nonchalance with which the possible withdrawal of Bjorn Höck's basic rights is being discussed, because the moral political rather than constitutionally justified expatriation of unwelcome citizens is considered a more effective means of combating right-wing extremist positions than the courage to engage in political debate. The German government, which considers itself the state whose mere custodian it is, neither trusts the institutions to confront unruly citizens in any other way than by exclusion and vilification, nor does it trust itself to take sides by declaring political enemies, even if these declarations are open to attack, and to make it clear whose side it is actually on. Accordingly, the enemy aliens she identifies inside and out are not just the right-wingers or the radicals, but all those who do not fit into the virtuous moral politics, which is the new extremism of the center. From the perspective of such moral politics, it actually makes no difference whether the state delegitimizer relevant to the protection of the Constitution is an identitarian new rightist like Sellner, a classic right-wing extremist like Höck, a socialist and Jewish woman like Fraser, or a stale anti-imperialist and anti-Zionist like Varoufakis. The only thing that bothers the new woke ruling clique about all of them is that they are people who have a worldview, however narrow-minded, with which they measure reality, however erroneously and distorted. The new Greens, like Baerbock and Habeck, Post-socialist social democrats like Olaf Scholz and post-liberal free democrats like Christian Lindner have not had a worldview for a long time. The only thing left to them from the good old ideologies of the bourgeois age is the relentlessness with which they serve the current political ticket or exchange it for another. The convergence of authoritarianism and arbitrariness is what is really dangerous. If Sarah Wagenknecht were foreign minister, as dreadful as that idea would be, at least the citizens would know what political pathology they would be dealing with, because Wagenknecht, like Varoufakis, is a reliable anti-imperialist who can be relied upon to fight. With Baerbock, Habeck and company, on the other hand, who would hand over the same Israel, whose right to exist they now declare to be a matter of state, to its worst enemies tomorrow, just as the inclusion pedagogue hands over his most unstable students to his most dull-witted students, nothing is predictable anymore. They never even acquire the conscience, the bite of which bourgeois politicians felt, at least temporarily. Because they lack any conscience, they are also incapable of political judgment and confuse the truth with what suits them. The Bremen political scientist Philip Mano regards the crisis of representative democracy that has taken place in recent decades as the result of a loss of control and the associated loss of trust in the political mediation authorities. This crisis, which particularly affects the political organizational form of parties, results, on the one hand, from a repeated structural change in the public sphere. The drastically expanding possibilities for participation, organization and communication through the internet and social media have brought about a democratization of democracy, but have also triggered a loss of control and function in which the traditional mediation instances for domesticating and containing democratic negotiation processes are increasingly being suspended. Which is how, to return to Baudrillard's fallacy in the reasoning behind his simulation theory, Pandora's box is opened in the first place, through which a flood of images conveyed by the mass media can actually turn into a real staging supported by the masses, as the fight against the far right presents itself. At the same time, the national political institutions, above all the established parties, are increasingly restricted in their scope of action by the transfer of decision-making processes to supranational organizations. These increasingly powerful transnational entities, which must be understood as essentially the result of the universalist expansionism of the world market, largely elude democratic control and legitimation. This undermines the functionality of bourgeois democratic negotiation processes, which are only given within the framework of nation-state communities, because the necessary particular relationship of recognition between citizens and between them and the instances representing them is permanently damaged as a result of the delimitation of democratically no longer legitimized decision-making processes. Since the democratic principle of rule lost its negative countervailing principle with the collapse of the utopia of communism, which had competed with it for the realization of the liberal democratic promise of equality, democracy, according to Mano, must legitimize itself from within, and that also means, the only threat to democracy now comes from democracy itself. The democratization of democracy diagnosed by Mano thus turns into its opposite, a threat to democracy from discourses that endanger democracy. Right-wing populism, which Mano sees as only one symptom of the general crisis-ridden development he has outlined, becomes a projection screen for precisely those discourses endangering democracy. The disease is projected onto the symptom. The loss of control and function of representative democratic institutions and their actors is subsequently invoked as a danger to democracy as a whole. Due to the denial of reality that is already inherent in the projection process, the rescue of democracy takes on the form of a staging of reality, in which a reference to reality that is oriented towards actual living conditions, linked to economic constraints and requirements, and takes into account the concrete existential concerns and needs of citizens, is becoming increasingly less important. At the same time, however, it hypermoralizes every social expression of life of the people, right down to the most private, and tries to activate them for the hallucinatory final battle against the right. The politically independent citizen, acting in his own interests, is imagined as the counterprinciple that negatively legitimizes democracy. In his role as a citoyen and constitutionally relevant government delegitimizer, which he always is by virtue of his right to vote, he is declared a troublemaker endangering the welfare of the state and potentially a state legitimizer relevant to the Constitution as soon as he questions government dogmas. Debates initiated by the so-called civil society and appreciated by the political establishment, along with petitions to withdraw the right to vote and, consequently, the right to stand for election, are both frightening and logical consequences of this construction of the enemy. The political thinking and feeling of Hannah Arendt for the dangers of totalitarianism, the literary scholar Ingeborg Nordmann once wrote, pointedly summarizes that the greatest danger in modernity does not come from the attraction of nationalist and racist ideologies, but from the loss of reality. If there is no resistance from reality, then in principle anything becomes possible. The idea of total malleability takes the place of the vanished reality and functions as fact. This loss of reality, resulting from the hubris of their total malleability, entails a loss of political judgment, as can be seen from all the political stagings of recent years mentioned above, but it can be seen particularly exemplarily in the case of Hans-Georg Maassen, because an example is being made of him to this day. It does not matter what one might subjectively think of Hans-Georg Maassen or his political ambitions and content, because it does not change the objective fact that and in what way the image of a right-wing extremist who is supposedly a threat to the state is successively drawn here, of someone who has served this state for decades in various institutions, right up to the highest offices. The way in which Maassen lost his post as president of the BFV in 2018 can be seen as an expression of the crisis of institutional mediation outlined above. In a functioning democratic state, it should be a matter of course for the head of an authority such as the BFV to express his well-founded doubts about the realistic content of the interpretation of this or that flood of images in the media. However, the situation is different when the images have already usurped reality, when the narrative of the hunt, which is linked to them and politically driven, has already become an imagination that occupies reality, not a realistic assessment, but a pictorially generated spectacle that becomes the guiding force behind the discourse staging the threat to democracy. The essential qualification of Thomas Haldenwang, Maassen's successor in office, is probably not only that he has no doubts about the premise of the fight against the right, which overrides all political issues of the present and unites all established parties from CSU to the Left Party, but that the loss of reality necessary to create this reality-replacing production has already become second nature to him. Otherwise, it is difficult to explain how he first turned his ex-superior into a test case and now, based on an endless collection of possibly controversial but constitutionally unobjectionable expressions of opinion, various accusations of guilt by association, and positive references to third parties who are also considered dubious, into a right-wing extremist suspicious case within his agency. While Haldenwang, in his more than 5 years in office as vice president of the BFV, apparently did not notice any right-wing extremist ideas of his boss. But if there is no resistance from reality, then in principle anything becomes possible. Not only did it become possible to relabel a high-ranking official of the state apparatus, who in his previous role had been instrumental in combating real enemies of the state for more than 6 years, as one of them within a short period of time. But beyond that, and connected to that, an adaptation of the purpose of an institution like the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, whose existence is a peculiarity of Germany in comparison to most other Western states, to the demands of a government elite that increasingly sees itself as identical with the state. The original purpose of the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, which was defined as the observation and defense against efforts directed against the free and democratic basic order, has now been dissolved in the direction of a deliberately vague concept of the so-called state welfare. This is evidenced by a statement made by Haldenwang, who on February 13, 2024, at the presentation of a new package of measures against right-wing extremism at the Federal Press Conference, stated that protecting the supposedly endangered national welfare now even requires the observation and combating of mental border shifts. This announcement is not only emblematic of the presumptuous attempt to expand his powers for the purpose of statewide snooping on attitudes, but, if thought through to its consequent conclusion, is nothing less than the totalitarian endeavor to establish thought control in the name of a political elite that wants to rid itself of all constitutional restrictions. It is, in truth, the official jargon of state-sponsored delegitimizers of that free and democratic basic order, because its core substance should be the guarantee of human dignity, according to Article 1, Paragraph 1 of the German Basic Law, GG, for the protection of which the principle of the rule of law is constitutive, especially against the arbitrariness of the state. But at the same time, it is the jargon of post-Nazi German ideology. The affirmative language of the Free and Democratic Basic Order, FDGO, has been ambiguous since the founding years of the Federal Republic. It functions as a value system that spans the specific legal provisions of the Basic Law. Despite its rather vague and indeterminate definition, it serves the state as a standard and condition for maintaining public security, which is why various constitutional lawyers have occasionally characterized it as superlegality, and a point of entry for state intervention to protect the status quo on account of this property. Because concrete political majorities are not cemented, legality is therefore a changeable norm. One only has to consider the corresponding implications of the planned self-determination law, which even overrides biologically determined facts. The free democratic basic order is characterized by precisely that element of arbitrariness that had already distinguished the fascist concept of the Volksgemeinschaft. As Clemens Nachtmann formulated it 30 years ago in his analysis of West German society, which was committed to the insights of critical theory, as a post-Nazi community at its core. This also explains the ease with which the ideologues of the Greenified All-Party Transformation Project, along with their planet-saving fantasies of omnipotence, were able to not only take control of the state apparatus, but also expand its purpose beyond the core state task defined by Althusser of reproducing the relations of production. The announcements by Bavarian Minister of the Interior Nancy Faeser, who is now also taking far-reaching measures against unpopular expressions of opinion that explicitly fall below the threshold of criminal liability, expose her as a spiritual descendant of such an attitude, which places fundamental freedoms under the proviso that they are only to be exercised in a form that is beneficial to the functioning of the social whole, to the common or national good. Just as only 2 years ago, during the Great Pandemic, the measure of this beneficialness was an abstract public health measured in incidences, which was allegedly threatened by lateral-thinking walkers and vaccination refuseniks. Today the imagined danger comes mainly from critics of uncontrolled Islamic mass migration, from those who refuse supposedly gender-sensitive language corruption, and from tractor drivers whose economic existence is threatened. What they all have in common, or are accused of, is mocking the state and thus endangering the common good. It is no coincidence that this could remind us of the Heimtückgesetz, law against treason, enacted by the Nazi Party, which restricted the right to freedom of expression in order to protect the welfare of the Reich and the reputation of the Reich government. Thus fascism has become a fungible token in this country, its evocation a means for established politics to steadily perfect that arsenal of defensive instruments, the use of which then only needs to be legitimized in the fight against the specter of rampant right-wing extremism, as the occasion demands. To do this, the state merely has to produce a tactical ideology of power struggles and act as if it were already a matter of the struggle for political power in the state. In the absence of a radical right-wing mass movement making the streets unsafe, the imagination of such a danger, along with a subsequent theatrical production, is thus constructed in a visually stunning way, exemplified by the farce of the secret plan against Germany, which the state and civil society are now using to take the fight to the streets. In the form of a mobilization that lasted for weeks, in the context of which the subjects who had been educated to exercise responsible moral self and external control for decades by state-subsidized civil society institutions and initiatives because it requires not external, abstract obedience to set rules, but rather unreserved existential partisanship, no matter what, the willingness to be available for every trick of power. Or as Wolfgang Port once aptly put it, it is impossible for a German to simply not do something. Either he does it, or he is active in preventing it, excluding it, etc. And at the forefront are not a few of the former anti-Germans, who, mostly academically educated like him, like a fish in water in the just milieu of that civilly organized Red Front Fighters League. They have successfully offered themselves as intellectual mouthpieces in the fight against alleged state delegitimizers from the right with their anti-Semitism theoretically enlightened solidarity with Israel and whose accusations of anti-Semitism function ever more arbitrarily purely tactically, detached from any justification, and that means tending to resemble their research object itself, in a pathologically projective way. As noisy as the tone of their outrage was in the case of the leaflet by Hubert Aiwanger, who was barely 17 years old at the time of writing, so deafening is their silence when the pogrom of October 7th is glorified by professional Palestinians lining up on the streets by the thousands in the general mobilization of the state anti-fascist United Front. Their refusal to talk about the necessity of the re-immigration of such anti-Semites is hidden behind a cheap, and in truth devious solidarity with Israel, in which the defense of the sovereignty of the Jewish state serves first and foremost to preserve it as a shelter in case their objectively pro-Islamic anti-right agitation should once again make this country uninhabitable for Jews. As ideologically critical tigers, they have now ended up as state anti-fascist bedside rugs in the antechambers of the ideological state apparatus. If today a government that is concerned with the big picture, i.e. world peace and climate, sabotages the reproductive capacity of an entire national economy with an economic and energy policy that can only be called erratic, and thus quite tangibly delegitimize the very foundations of the state by placing its entire operations under the radical proviso of the ideological pipe dream of a climate justice to be achieved, such conformism has contributed to this, and thus to a policy of transformation towards a state that even the situationists, in their view, which was already blind to the specifics of German ideology and essentially narrowed down to economic determinants, could not have anticipated, namely that capital in this country is soon threatening to become a museum piece itself, to visitors to which a museum director named Robert Habeck could then explain that capital is not gone at all, but is merely reproducing itself elsewhere. If, as a result, money itself becomes too scarce to keep the bloated sector of ideological reproduction happy, the obvious solution would be to outsource this racket and clique system of civil society to the Islamic specialists in this field, who have been brought into the country by the millions over the past 10 years. Whether the same applies to them, however, that Lenin said about the Germans, namely that they would first buy a train ticket before storming a train station, is questionable. Especially in a country that, despite all the talk of a transportation revolution, no longer has an intact train system. Officially proclaimed in Prague on August 29, 2022, the Zeitenwende turning point, which is said to be a pan-European but at the same time specifically German phenomenon, is now being invoked more loudly than military support for Ukraine for the widespread installation of heat pumps and adherence to extreme weather emergency plans. On that day, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz gave a speech at the local Charles University about the European heritage of Eastern Europe, in which he programmatically sharpened a formulation from his government declaration of February of the same year, in which he had called Russia's attack on Ukraine a Zeitenwende, a term first used by Hitler in 1923 to describe a turning point or new era. In Prague, Scholz said, "Putin's Russia wants to draw new borders by force, something we in Europe never wanted to experience again. The brutal invasion of Ukraine is thus also an attack on the European security order. From now on, it is imperative to give the right answers to the turning point throughout Europe and transnationally." In his Prague speech, Scholz described the Zeitenwende as a caesura that demonstrates the necessity of enforcing European law against the anachronistic legal order of the great powers. The representative of that outdated great power order is Vladimir Putin. As early as February, with regard to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, Scholz said, "We are experiencing a turning point. And that means, the world after that will no longer be the same as the world before." At the core of the matter is the question of whether power can break the law, whether we allow Putin to turn back the clocks to the time of the great powers of the 19th century, or whether we muster the strength to set limits to warmongers like Putin. Quote end. Contrary to the views of the New Old Peace movement, which has since taken a stand against the alleged warmongering of the German government, Scholz himself justified his appeal in the spirit of a love of peace, which he presented as a German-European mission. However, this mission is not aimed solely at containing illegitimate claims to great power, but at the self-exclusion of Western nation-statehood in general. In order to put Russian imperialism in its place, Scholz said, what is needed is a coordinated European policy of self-restraint from national egoisms. Quote, in view of the Zeitenwende, our yardstick is, whatever is needed to secure peace in Europe will be done. The Zeitenwende does not only affect our country, it affects the whole of Europe. The challenge is to strengthen the sovereignty of the European Union in a sustainable and lasting way. End of quote. Scholz argued entirely in line with the project of a voluntary self-bracketing of the European nation-states in favor of a Europe standing up to Russian claims to great power when he sold the Eastern European states, first and foremost Poland and the Czech Republic, which the German government considered to be narrow-minded and nationalist, the delegation of their national sovereignty to the EU as a necessary contribution to the fight against Russian imperialism. In doing so, he did not forget to affirm that, of course, Germany would also do its part in this fight, and unspoken, but clearly directed at the smaller Eastern European states, pleaded for the dismantling of the unanimity principle in European policy decisions in view of the pressure to act generated by Russia. Quote, I have proposed a gradual transition to majority decisions in common foreign policy, but also in other areas such as tax policy, knowing full well that this would also have implications for Germany. We must be clear about one thing. Adhering to the principle of unanimity only works when the pressure to act is low. But at the latest, in the face of the Zeitenwende, this is no longer the case. End of quote. In such an evocation of the lack of alternatives, the foreign policy rhetoric of the Zeitenwende resembles the panic policy that the German government pursued during the corona pandemic and which it is now continuing in the areas of climate protection and the energy transition. There is no longer any effort to formulate comprehensible arguments in defense of one's own permanent emergency policy. The pressure to act makes any argument superfluous. According to Scholz, the reason why the nation-states are being forced to weld themselves together under the umbrella of the EU, while sacrificing their national sovereignty, is not because it would be reasonable, but because the common external enemy is forcing them to do so. This enemy is indirectly blamed for high electricity prices, nutrition traffic lights, and the consequences of green shrinkage. Quote, Putin's Russia defines itself, in opposition to the European Union. Putin will exploit every disagreement between us, every weakness. The citizens expect an EU that delivers. The citizens expect the EU to deliver very tangible things, for example, more speed in climate protection, healthy food, sustainable supply chains. Quote end. Nothing in this chain of associations is valid. Germany, and in particular Scholz's party, did the most to facilitate Russia's preparation for its attack before the outbreak of Putin's war, which is a German war in a certain respect precisely because of this. For a long time, the situation in Ukraine since the annexation of Crimea has hardly interested anyone in this country. Only since it suits the overall energy policy of the Green federal government has Russia been declared the embodiment of evil by those who previously protected it. And contrary to Scholz's insinuation, the idea that the EU is delivering on the federal government's wish list makes citizens feel uneasy rather than hopeful. It is only the sleight of hand that turns an unrealistic domestic policy goal, energy transition, rejected by the majority of citizens into a pretext for foreign policy that enables the transition from the war theme to the green and now also social democratic hobby horses of climate protection, healthy food, and sustainable supply chains. Annalena Baerbock took up these favorite topics when she spoke at the Hamburg Vigoni Forum on July 8, 2022, about European democracy at the Zeitenwende. Here she explained how, in an echo of the speech by the new normal, created by the corona pandemic, quote, "There will be no return to the time before this attack. We did not wish for this new reality, but we cannot hide from it. We will only create security in the 21st century if we think of it in all its dimensions, if we protect our liberal democracies from the hatred that troll factories pump into social networks, and if we fight the climate crisis that threatens our livelihoods worldwide." End of quote. The blurring of the boundaries of the term Zeitenwende, which in foreign policy terms was previously aimed at Russia, in the sense of a metapolitical caesura affecting the entire lives of people not only in Germany, is being driven by Baerbock. It picks up on a tendency towards metaphorization of the word that is being promoted by civil society organizations, and February 2022, the Bund für Umwelt und die Naturschutz, Bund, Friends of the Earth Germany, published the following assessment by its managing director Antje von Broek under the headline "A Turning Point in the Fight Against the Climate Crisis." Chancellor Olaf Scholz spoke of a turning point with regard to the war in Ukraine. "We are also at such a turning point in view of the climate crisis. The climate impacts are occurring faster than before and hitting us harder than expected. The climate crisis is also a security threat." End of quote. In November 2022, the Munich-based IFO Institute published a dossier on the topic Climate Corona War, Is the Social Market Economy at a Turning Point? On May 2, 2023, the Bertelsmann Foundation discussed Monetary Policy at a Turning Point, How to Deal with the Climate Crisis. And the Prime Minister of Baden-Württemberg, Winfried Kretschmann, for whom the climate crisis also marks a turning point, said at the 38th German Protestant Kirchentag last June, "Climate change is the human challenge of our time. With its consequences, it affects everything. You couldn't imagine a more complex challenge." Quote end. If we do not accept the talk of a Zeitenwende as the rhetorical lubricant it is used to be, and instead ask about its objective function, it becomes recognizable as a propagandistic translation of politics into metapolitics, of national interests into moralizing human idealism, of instrumental reason into world missionizing. The vocabulary of the Zeitenwende is metapolitical instead of political, pseudo-religious instead of pragmatic, and never addresses the individual, the mature citizen, but an imagined human community. Pressure to act, threat to the foundations of life, turning point, task for humanity, challenge as opportunity, crisis everywhere. Such urgent rhetoric, which suggests that the apocalypse is imminent and that each individual is being asked to decide whether they want to enter paradise or burn in hell after the great cleansing, has been part of the invocation of a new normal since Corona, from which the proclamation of the Zeitenwende emerged. Criticism of this metapoliticization of foreign, domestic, economic, infrastructure and health policy, all of which are being subjected to the imperative of the new normal and new era, comes not from critics of ideology and political activists but almost exclusively from conservatives, who are making themselves increasingly suspicious by clinging to their conservatism. In the summer issue of the quarterly magazine Tumult, for example, former FAZ editor Karsten Jermis projected a portrait of Ludwig-Born Prize winner Robert Habeck, whom he characterized as a powerfully eloquent Gnostic in reference to political scientist Eric Voegelin. According to Voegelin, the modern Gnostic as a specific manifestation of the political theologian is characterized by the fact that for his political action, the non-recognition of reality is a matter of principle. He imagines himself in an apocalyptic present in which a backward people is to be led to maturity by the historical avant-garde of philosophers. For the Gnostic empirical reality, the everyday life of people, the conditions under which they live, as well as their individual needs, are merely considered as material for the realization of a second reality, which must be peeled from the filthy, flawed, imperfect reality. In his writing The Eclipse of Reality, written in the late 1960s, Voegelin describes the missionary political activism displayed by the modern Gnostic as unbridled voluntarism. as the complete subjugation of living, finite, and imperfect reality to the primacy of a world interior policy, which is not intended to shape people's living conditions in a humane way, but to destroy and replace them with a metapolitical ideal. But unlike Vogelin suggests, the modern Gnostic, whom Jermis recognizes in the Green philosopher Vice-Chancellor, is not only a groundless idealist who instrumentalizes society as a toy for his wishful fantasies. Rather, he is also a pragmatic pragmatist and an unrestrained muddler who cannot leave anything as it is, finds nothing traditional worth preserving, for whom no private sphere, no property, no territory and no habit is sacred anymore, and who therefore meddles in everything, knowing better, which would function much better without his intrusive interventions. That is why the maxims of his political action are neither reform nor revolution, but disruption and sabotage, the wanton destruction of the traditional as well as the hoped for. Using a pair of terms coined by the historian Reinhard Koselleck, the consequences of such politics can be described as the destruction of the everyday background of citizens' experiences, while at the same time closing off their horizons of expectation. Disruption means that everything people could count on yesterday can be cancelled tomorrow, and tradition, experiential knowledge, and common sense no longer count for anything, while in the future only corruption or redemption can be expected, but not an improvement in the individual's living conditions. That is why the politics of the Zeitenwende is a politics of the destruction of the course of life, of the termination of any comprehensible mediation between the past and the future, between experience and hope. It aims to create a world in which anything can be expected at any time, but nothing better for the individual, and in which everything that makes up a human life, for better or for worse, can be immediately and groundlessly revoked, the liquidation of normality. That is why anyone who disagrees with this policy is labeled a right-winger or at least right-leaning, regardless of whether they are actually a leftist or liberal. Anyone who believes that there is still something to save and to realize, and that life is not exhausted in constantly reacting to ever-new impositions, is out of the game. This is what the time looks like, which the Zeitenwende prepares the way for, and from which people can probably only save themselves by pulling the emergency brake. When Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock reported to the Bundestag in April on her trip to China and answered related questions from MPs, her diction deviated remarkably from the verbal radicalism currently being practiced by the German government and the Green Party in particular towards Russia. If Vladimir Putin's regime, which was not only nursed economically by Germany under the chancellorship of Gerhard Schroeder, but also under that of Angela Merkel, is now, under Olaf Scholz, being denounced, correctly but very late and therefore implausibly, as an exponent of a Russian imperialism against which the West, under the non-military but moral leadership of Germany, must stand together, China appeared in Baerbock's presentation less as an opponent or even an enemy than as an adversary that must be reckoned with at all times. Before her trip in mid-April, Baerbock had already proclaimed not only on behalf of Germany, but also for the whole of Europe, partner, competitor, systemic rival, that is the compass of Europe's China policy. After her trip she added, in a tone that was half alarmed and half fascinated, that the aspect of systemic rival is growing ever stronger, and not only because China is acting more offensively, one could even say aggressively, on the outside, but above all more repressively on the inside. End of quote. She called the political situation in China, in part, more than shocking. The task of Europe and the West, she said, was to use the economic partnership with the People's Republic to secure long-term freedom and the rule of law, and to stand up for the freedom, prosperity and security of all of us. She did not elaborate on how this would work in the context of rivalry with a totalitarian state. As is almost always the case when the media public attests that someone has found clear words, FAZ about Baerbock, the opposite was true in reality. The words of the foreign minister were conspicuously unclear. Anyone who finds the state of civil liberties in China shocking rather than merely worrying, Baerbock had met with Chinese human rights activists outside the official program, but in the same breath does not describe the same country as a hostile power, but as a systemic rival. This suggests that China should not be strictly rebuked for its aggressive foreign policy and repressive domestic policy, but outdone by the West. After all, one state can only be a systemic rival to another within the framework of a common reference system, an overarching compass. In this reference system, the character of which Baerbock left remarkably undefined, Russia no longer seems to have a place, unlike in previous years, while such a place is still granted to China, which is indeed economically and administratively backward compared to Russia. This contradiction also characterized Baerbock's travel diplomacy. Only AfD politicians were denied the trip to China because they are seen as Putin apologists and therefore untrustworthy, while Social Democrats were allowed to accompany Baerbock as a matter of course, without the SPD's importance as a Putin circle of friends and the warning issued by the SPD's internal Seeheim circle against an anti-China strategy on the occasion of Baerbock's trip had not caused major internal party upheaval. Such contradictions indicate that those who believe they can discern an alternative in the Greens' foreign policy course to the SPD's holding position in supporting Ukraine and defending the West could soon be disappointed. Rather than representing a Western path, the Greens' current foreign policy represents that third way that has traditionally been a unique feature of Germany in contrast to Western liberalism. Its characteristic is a mixture of hostility and admiration for successful totalitarian regimes, in that freedom and the rule of law are demanded of a state that is at the same time attested to be acting more offensively externally and more repressively internally than ever, which is thus perceived as a competitor that should not be eliminated, but outcompete. If China's domestic and foreign policy situation is shocking, then, according to this logic, it can only be understood as an invitation for the Western community of values to accept the challenge and transform its own statehood accordingly. Unlike Russia, which Germany is increasingly behaving towards in a presumptuous manner despite its defensive realpolitik, China serves as a kind of hostile model for authoritarian domestic political self-armament in the Green Party. The systematic confusion of foreign and domestic policy also characterizes Robert Habeck's energy transition, which can be interpreted as part of a transformation of democracy. This is what the political scientist Johannes Agnoli called in 1968, with reference to the history of Italian fascism and German National Socialism, the process by which formerly Western states transform the institutions they themselves have developed and thereby achieve the opposite of what these institutions are supposed to serve. Such a transformation makes it clear that totalitarian systems are not simply the opposite of democratic ones, but that under certain conditions they can also emerge from them. The pair of opposites, democracy and dictatorship, does not adequately describe the process of erosion that Agnoli calls transformation of democracy. At least one of the characteristics of this transformation, which he outlined and which the social philosopher Max Horkheimer similarly noted in the 1940s in his Reflections on the Authoritarian State, is reflected in current Green foreign policy, the instrumentalization of national sovereignty as a mere function of a transnationally delimited domestic policy. This dissolution of boundaries is not only evident in the design of Habeck's department, insofar as economic policy, by its very nature, has to advocate for national interests that are counteracted by the goals of a transnational climate policy. The dissolution of the boundaries between domestic and foreign policy in the name of a world interior policy that is moving away from realpolitik imperatives is also evident in the rhetoric of turning points and new beginnings, which Habeck and Baerbock use as they please in domestic and foreign policy. Habeck's energy transition, which he is pushing not in the name of national interests but of the global climate, is an echo of the Zeitenwende, or turning point, that Baerbock proclaimed in July of last year in her speech at the University of Hamburg's Vigoni Forum, entitled European Democracy at the Turning Point of the Times, in response to the Russian war of aggression. Not only did she speak not only of European democracies, but of the European democracy, as if all of Europe were a world sovereign incarnate in Germany, but in the same breath she took up the invocation of a new normality that has been common since the corona pandemic by decreeing, there will be no return to the time before this attack. We did not wish for this new reality, but we cannot hide from it. End quote. 9 months later, at the G7 foreign ministers' meeting in Japan last April, she no longer described the war that the West, alongside Ukraine, had to wage against Russia in terms of foreign policy, but in terms of climate policy, when she praised the German government. With our help, Ukraine has withstood Russia's energy war and winter offensive in recent months. That in the face of the Zeitenwende, there are no longer any boundaries between domestic, foreign, economic, climate and health policy, but rather that in the future all departments would best be integrated into one and the same world interior policy, in the sense in which Jürgen Habermas also uses this term in his Reflections on European Policy, was already formulated quite unphilosophically by the psychologist Kristen Stocker in February 2021, when he knew no parties, but only Thanatos in The Spiegel under the heading Corona and Climate, Nature Knows No Compromises. Death is non-partisan. Disasters are not a matter of political orientation. New normal, Zeitenwende, no compromises, such rhetoric, whose ominous undertone stands in clear contrast to the pseudo-objective reference to facts evidence-based and scientific, which the same protagonists otherwise claim for themselves, is in the service of a new holism that respects no factual differences between political departments and therefore basically no longer respects a division of labor. Its dogma is rather that everything is somehow connected with everything else and therefore selfish individual interests must take a back seat in the name of the whole, the climate, world health, sustainability. This dogma has always distinguished the concept of climate from the older concept of the environment. The politics of environmental protection, to which the Green Party still felt committed well into the 1990s, always implied, alongside many falsehoods, sensible proposals for urban planning and landscape conservation, because environment is a word for nature that is civilized and cultivated, and thus close to and as humane as possible to humans. The situation is completely different with the climate. It dissolves the boundaries of the civic statehood differentiated into nations, tends to disempower any reasonable municipal and infrastructure policy, and sees citizens not as potential beneficiaries of citizen-oriented environmental protection but only as potential enemies of climate protection, which is by definition transnational. Since the coronavirus crisis, the tendency to blur the boundaries between political departments and the goals assigned to them in Germany has been accompanied by an increasingly aggressive and brazen policy of constant disruption. It seems as if citizens will no longer be able to rely on anything in the future. Every economic, political, and private action that requires a reliable framework in order to develop is to be replaced by blind reaction to the permanent redefinition of these framework conditions by the state or its civil society organizations. That arbitrariness and capriciousness, anarchy and repression merge with each other in this redefinition is sufficiently known from the Corona period. When the unmanageable patchwork of measures was legitimized from week to week, it will either with the incidence figures or the occupancy of hospital beds, the R number or the vaccination rate, and therefore no longer justified de facto. Since the Zeitenwende that followed the new normalcy, which is an energy turn, which in turn is supposed to be part of an energy war, the regime of measures that has been tried and tested in the field of health policy has become even more blurred. Depending on the whim of those in power, economic policy can determine foreign policy can determine climate policy can determine foreign policy, and health policy can determine climate policy. But this dissolution of boundaries is also accompanied by an intensification of repressive measures to enforce them that is unprecedented in the history of the Federal Republic. Should Habeck's plans for a forced conversion of the energy supply become reality, the means used against tenants, landlords, companies and businesses in the event of non-compliance may make the period of the corona measures seem almost harmless. In 1941, the political scientist Ernst Fraenkel published his study The Dual State, in which he sought to grasp the authoritarian reorganization of bourgeois states, particularly Germany, which Johannes Agnoli described 25 years later as a transformation of democracy, using the pair of terms norm state and measure state. In the mode of the norm state, the liberal moments of bourgeois democracy live on in the double state, equality of all before the law, the correspondence between civil rights and duties, and the calculability of the relation between norm violation and punishment. But by reconstituting itself as a state of measures, the normative state simultaneously places the validity of its own norms under constant reservation and signals to its citizens that from now on they will all only be citizens for a limited time. It normativized itself and thus undermines its own foundations. As astonishing as it is to see how precisely Frankel's observations can be applied to the transformation of the nation-state under Baerbock, Habeck and their supporters, there is one crucial difference. The transformation of the dual state into open totalitarianism, which Fraenkel historically targeted, presupposed a foreign policy constellation in which such a dissolution of boundaries could become reality because it was met with only insufficient resistance from other nation-states. Today's green world interior policy, however, is always defensive, eccentric and politically naive at the same time, in all its boastful impertinence. Just as the nuclear phase-out would not have been possible without importing nuclear energy from other countries, which are morally condemned for their adherence to nuclear power, France, Poland, Great Britain, Germany's new war moralism towards Russia thrives on the fact that other, truly Western countries are doing the dirty work, again, alongside the USA, Poland. But a country whose government officials regularly morally humiliate and blacken those states on the foreign and European policy stage, from which they themselves parasitize and profit, will have a hard time getting away with such hypocrisy in the long term. If at some point this is no longer possible, Habeck's and Baerbock's idealistic repressive fantasies of world happiness could end up where they belong faster than expected, in the political jokebook of the 21st century. One of the latest absurd dramas performed by the Green Party on the stage of the German Bundestag was entitled Meshing. The word refers to the possibility in Great Britain of combining the surnames of spouses in a hybrid name. The Greens would like to see this option extended to Germany. If a Mr. Schneider marries a Mrs. Muller, both could then have the surname Schnuller. The Greens find this form of surname formation more original than the hyphenated double names that many of their party members have. Helga Limburg, legal policy spokesperson for the Green Parliamentary Group, praised meshing to the Welt as a refreshing innovation that is very charming. The fact that this would nullify the purpose of family names, which is to refer to the life historical genealogy to which their bearers remain connected even if they adopt a different surname, is of little concern to Limburg. After all, not only the Greens, but also the Free Democrats and Social Democrats want to allow adults and adolescents in the future to regularly change their gender in their passport entry in line with their respective sense of self. In comparison, replacing the family name with a nonsense combination would be a moderate reform. In its mixture of solemn earnestness and infantile arbitrariness, the meshing idea resembles the social behavior of leading Green politicians, which can be described as the corruption of politics and childhood or as the betrayal of fantasy to stupidity. When Annalena Baerbock, during her visit to Finland to negotiate the northern expansion of NATO, used the yellow markings on the floor of a civil defense bunker in Helsinki for a game of hopscotch hellgame and hopped from box to box like a 5-year-old, she did not take Pippi Longstocking's maxim, "I make the world as I like it" literally, but applied it to the dog of Realpolitik. For Pippi Longstocking, the maxim was neither a plea for thoughtless wishful thinking nor for escapism. Rather, it contained an appeal to change the world in which one lives so that one feels as comfortable as possible in it. When Baerbock, during a state visit, turns into a girl for a few minutes because of the arbitrary association of the bunker system with impressions from her childhood, only to then talk again as foreign minister about Putin and Erdogan, she proves to be more adult and therefore politically more threatening than Pippi Longstocking. In fact, the disturbing thing about the behavior of the Green ministers in the Scholz cabinet is not so much their childish naivety as the adult self-confidence with which they impose not only their own sovereign, but also, preferably, their childish fantasies of happiness on the whole world. "I'm Robert and this is Sem, we're ministers." Robert Habeck and Sem Oezdemir introduced themselves to members of a native tribe in Brazil, explaining that they were German chiefs, comparable to rainforest chiefs, and had come to learn about environmental protection from their hosts, because the forest in Europe had been destroyed 1,000 years ago. But it would be wrong to find the hubris with which habitual critics of colonialism declare themselves to be tribal chiefs and their hosts to be inferiors, unintentionally funny. Of course, the gestures of the uncle from the West, who jovially addresses the jungle inhabitants in the second person and lets them paint his cheeks, echoes the colonialists' habitus as landowners. And of course the humiliating way in which the ministers treated their hosts seems like a parody of the positive racism the Greens otherwise see as being at work when children in Western countries enjoy dressing up as Native Americans. But to laugh at such perversions would be to miss their point. For what is characteristic and new about today's Green infantilism is that it has merged with the self-confidence of a civil society whose members are sure that even their most embarrassing failures are morally integer and therefore beyond parody. Accordingly, the involuntary comedy that used to characterize old West German politicians has been replaced by a voluntary comedy that is lived out with aggressive self-assurance. This comedy can no longer be tackled by satire because the dissonance between aspiration and reality, intention and realization, has been leveled out, and the laughter provoked by satire could ignite. The unintentional humor of many politicians in the old Federal Republic, from Heinrich Lübke to Helmut Kohl and Edmund Stoiber to the young Rudolf Scharping, has been overtaken by the zeitgeist with Habeck, Baerbock and company. With their disappearance, a cultural asset of the 20th century is being lost, one that was not only cultivated by cabaret artists, but also appreciated by the objects of satire. For television satire in the old Federal Republic, from Dieter Hildebrandt Scheibenwischer to the Satire Fest broadcast on the third programs, a mirror cabinet-like elective affinity between mockers and mocked was characteristic. This manifested itself not only in the convention of having federal politicians sit in the audience themselves, where they listened to the mockery of their party colleagues and political opponents, but sometimes also to jokes about themselves. The affinity was also evident from the fact that there was an affinity between the cabaret artists and their targets, which reminded people that politics, especially in democratic states where it is a public stage, can resemble a farce. Accordingly, the gaffes of important politicians evoked the talent of great comedians, whose reenactments they appeared to be. The slips of the tongue and failures of the Christian Democrat Heinrich Lübke, who was federal president between 1959 and 1969, are so legendary that reality and invention have become mixed up in their retelling. The fact that Lübke greeted the population of Liberia in 1962 with "My dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Negroes" is actually just a rumor. But it is no rumor, for example, that during a visit to Cameroon he commented on the installation of public shower facilities with the sentence "people have to learn to keep clean." That during a speech on the June 17, 1954, uprising in 1965 on the Helmstedter Holzberg, he forgot the name of the town he was visiting, that after a trip to Canada, he reported that he had been there earlier with his friend Karl May, that he confused names and his flow of words repeatedly faltered in his self-oblivion. Lubka's mistakes unintentionally echoed the deliberately lame humor of Heinz Erhardt, which is why the satirical magazine Pardon released an LP in 1966 titled Heinrich Lubka Speaks for Germany, to defend his involuntary humor against the hostility of his mockers. Edmund Stoiber's unintentional humor, on the other hand, which experienced its heyday about 30 years after Lubka and can be viewed on the internet as an original sound collage entitled Stoiber's Gestammelt Werke, Stoiber's Stammered Works, since 2006, when Stoiber gave his famous speech about the problem bear poaching in the Bavarian forests, was more reminiscent of Karl Valentin. When Stoiber says about his private life, "I've got into the habit of looking at the garden every morning and perhaps killing a flower, otherwise I tell my wife what I would do, and then she does it." When he fails to explain the innovation of the Transrapid connection between Munich Central Station and the airport to the parliamentarians, if you take the Transrapid from Munich Central Station to the airport, you only need 10 minutes and you don't have to check in at the airport. Or when he says about the sister party CDU that it would take only a little spraying, so to speak, into the blazing lot, into the blazing flood, to bind them more closely to the CSU, then he is objectively on a par with the brilliant sketches of Valentin and Liesel Karlstadt. Stoiber was the political master of an unintentional humor that, in its effort to reflect its own ridiculousness in a sovereign way, opened up a meta-humor that could serve as new material for satirical Volkskamps. In this talent, he was the equal of Helmut Kohl, who, through his public appearances, through his criticism of uncomfortable seating, his notorious complaints about the communication style of television people, and his physical intervention against egg throwers, repeatedly proved himself in very real and everyday terms to be the successful provincial that Thomas Freitag only ever parroted in a mediocre way in the TV show Scheibenwischer. With Kohl and Stoiber, the offensively unintentional humor sometimes surpassed the intended humor of the satire in subtlety and pointedness. That's why they could afford to reflect on themselves as the subject and object of humor. Kohl, when he told his favorite Kohl jokes on ZDF to Gunter Jauch and Thomas Gottschalk in 1990. Stoiber, when asked about the effect of his slip-ups on him and his wife, said, "We both have a sense of humor. She in practice, I in theory." The unintentional humor of old West German politicians, which was better mastered by conservatives than by leftists, but was also present there, for example, when Rudolf Scharping failed to ring the bell to open a celebration, was only possible because its representatives were not identical with the role publicly demanded of them, but rather repeatedly afforded themselves the opportunity to fall back behind this role or to rise above it. West German satire, from Heinz Erhardt to Laureate to the self-lacerating humor of Gerhard Polt, who turned Franz Joseph Strauss's brutality against Strauss's own social character, was, so to speak, the cooperative complement of the satirically skewered, parodists and the parodied, sometimes embodied by one and the same person, contributed to the elevated level of satire at the time through the division of labor. The insultingly aggressive embarrassment of the personnel of the so-called traffic light, especially the Greens, no longer has any satirical opponents. Dieter Nuhr, one of those who sometimes tries, was himself once a member of the Greens and is far too equidistant and politically sensitive to distort what his former party colleagues are now doing into anything recognizable. Harold Schmidt, who around the turn of the millennium developed a matter-of-fact cynicism that could rival the banality of today's political ridicule, has largely withdrawn. Helge Schneider is lucky enough not to deal with current politics and has become an absolutist of nonsense who would be corrupted by dealing with cabinet members. Other so-called comedians, first and foremost Jan Bomerman, double the conformism of politics instead of distorting it. Politicians have already locked themselves up with their peers and lost any sense of self-distance that could enable them to laugh at themselves because of their certainty that good people talk to each other and to others in the tone of care psychologists. In the worst case, they express shame and remorse because of their lapses, but never humor. Thus, there is no one who could respond to their nonsense with a higher level of nonsense. However, rulers who no longer have fools in whom they can see themselves are the greatest danger for a democratic community that can be imagined.